Okay, we're going to get rolling. First off, came from somewhere. Probably most of you noticed if you were a winner or not, but I'm just going to read them off. So if you're a winner, go to the back desk and accept your prize. Cooperators Insurance, Aaron Ebersol. Quality Seeds, Brian Stevenson, Les Young. Bird Fuels, Nolda Scott and Mark Lemon. Trillium Insurance, Mark Wepler. Roberts Farm Equipment, Ron Teeple. UCal, Kenzie Getz. Artisan Farms, Barb Ryan, Roy Manro, and George Emerson. Master Choice, Dale Giffen. Howick Mutual, Tom Atkins. Bramhill, Stephen Stewart. Huron Tractor, Lawrence Lyons. Beef Farmers, Eric Thacker, Dave Thompson. And Germania, Robert Porteous. So if you go to the back desk, you can get your prizes and you got something to take home. Lori. So I'm not sure about you guys, but I know I'm well fed in water. Lori just told me it was County Line Women's Institute who did the meal, so I'm pretty sure they can't hear us, but let's clap for them anyways. That was excellent, and that was actually sponsored by West Grey Premium Beef, so we know where the beef came from. Time to roll on. We are moving into, where are we moving into? Beef Farmers of Ontario market update. So Vice President Rob Lipsett, I guess he's here. There he is, guy with the mic on. I'll get him to come up and tell you what's going on.
I'm going to apologize ahead of time. My whole family's been fighting this bug that seems to hit the province, so if I start to cough partway through, I'm sorry. If I lose my voice, that just means I'm going to cut out of here early. I'm not sure which is worse, having to go before you eat or after, but I have a real bad drone, so if anybody snores, I won't be offended. So a lot of things have happened in the past year. We're all aware that we have a new government that took office in June. Minister Hardeman is the new Minister of Agriculture. He's been very accessible. We've enjoyed quite a few meetings with him since June. He's out in the country a lot. I know he was here in this area just before Christmas. This isn't the only place that they've had that kind of access to him. But it became pretty apparent early on that with the new government, they made comments about there will be no new money available. I reminded them that that didn't mean we wouldn't ask for money anyways, but they made a commitment to some red tape reduction and some removal of some regulations. So we quickly changed gears and identified a few things that we thought they could do to help the beef industry. The Ontario Risk Management Program was one of the things that they pledged support to. Throughout the campaign, we've made it quite clear to them that this is the only program that beef farmers currently have for an insurance program to kind of measure up with supply management and the crop insurance program. So they had made a commitment in the campaign that they would add an extra $50 million to the program by year 3 of their mandate. Through some of the things that went on this year, including some trade disputes south of the border that have caused an oversupply of proteins in North America, it seems that it drove our beef prices down a bit. So we've told them that there's a lot of things adding up that are hurting the beef prices, and the program probably needs to have a second look at it and bring that $50 million ahead a few years, not necessarily wait till 2021. Some of the things we cited to them were that the average finished animal lost $235 per head in 31 of the first 35 weeks of the year. And the other thing that seemed to have hurt our industry was the U.S. Farm Bill package, with a promise of $12 billion to, most of it went to beef and pork in the States, and that put us at a real competitive disadvantage. We then talked to them about the wildlife damage compensation program, and Minister Hardeman early on had committed to making some of the changes that we'd been asking for. One of the things that really bothered us was the appeals process. If you had a claim that was denied and you decided to appeal it, OMAFRA did the appeal in-house. So essentially they gave it to someone they worked with and said, you tell me if I made the right decision or not. And that's pretty tough to tell a coworker you were wrong. So we brought that up to them, and they've made a commitment that they'll start a third-party, independent, industry-led appeals process. They also decided that they could improve some of the valuations for the calf pricing. They're going to split out steers and heifers. The program previously had put in an average price for that. They want to go back to the two different pricing systems. Some of the changes that have been asked for that they are not going to commit to is that they will not provide compensation unless you, the producer, can provide a carcass. They will not pay a higher premium for pedigreed animal unless you can provide a registration paper. And they will not provide compensation if there are no pictures, you do not have a premise ID, or a farm business registration number. One of the other things we asked them for under the farm business registration number was perhaps they would allow a claim if we could prove we were in the process of getting a farm business registration number. And that sounds like one of the announcements they're going to come out with here shortly, late next month, that if you are going to get your numbers, you can get the compensation. This fall was big for all levels of government on a trade platform. The Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, otherwise known as NAFTA, couldn't have been agreed to at a better time for the fall calf run. I think we saw 3 weeks of prices bump up after the three countries decided that they could reach an agreement for the program. And then since then it's slid a little bit. But on the heels of that came the CPTPP agreement, which looks like it could be a better one for Ontario specifically. It was a big thing that Canada be one of the first 6 countries to sign. The first 6 countries got immediate access to the agreement. Anybody that signs on from here on out has to wait for a period of 60 days before they can enjoy the benefits of a lower tariff rate. So getting in first was good for us, especially with Japan, because the Ontario Corn-Fed Beef Program has done a lot of groundwork, and they actually have quite a big market in Japan, and so now they can access that at the lower tariff rate. Some of the policies that we dealt with and put a real priority on in the last year was, number one was the changes to the antimicrobial regulations. I know that that came into effect in December, so some of our slides are a little bit out of date, but most of you know to get some of the medications that are on the list, you need to get a prescription from a vet. To get a prescription, you must have a vet-client-patient relationship. What we found out is different vets require something different from a vet-client-patient relationship. The Ontario College of Vets did not prescribe a checklist of what constitutes a relationship. So you need to contact your vet if you haven't and find out what you need to do to have that relationship so that you can get access to some of the medications that now require the prescription. We talked a little bit, Karen did before lunch, on the transport regulations. The transport regulations from the federal government was a pretty strong lobby point for BFO in the past year. When they went from the 48 hours with a 4-hour window without having to unload cattle dropping it to a hard 36 and you must take the cattle off the truck started to concern us a little bit because it's pretty tough to get from Alberta and Saskatchewan to Thunder Bay or even further in 36 hours. Part of our biggest problem was that beyond the animal welfare issue that they were stating, they didn't look at any of the infrastructure involved in unloading cattle. So when we posed questions of what do we do if we are in southern Manitoba at the 36 hours on the Trans-Canada Highway, and their answer was let the cattle off the trailer. They had no idea that there is no rest station. And so then their answer was, well, someone will see that as a business opportunity and open a rest stations along the Trans-Canada. I'm sure they will. So our next question was, well, what about biosecurity? We just had a TB outbreak, and this was last year in southern Alberta. And now you're saying that you want us to mix cattle even more when there's an option to move on. So there were a lot of things they hadn't looked at. And I'm not sure when they're going to come up with the regulations. I know it was discussed this morning. They keep saying it's coming. They have admitted that they got more comments on this particular legislation change than any other one they've had in history. They will admit that some of them were in favor of the changes, most of them were against, which opened a lot of eyes. We, from Ontario's perspective, understand we bring a lot of feeder cattle from the west to Ontario. That is our feedlot industry. We're worried that if they change the regulations too much, it could impact that negatively. Agri-Food and Agriculture Canada's own research says that cattle on long-haul trucking make it in trips over 12 hours, arrive at destination without incident 99.95% of the time. So when we were in Ottawa at the 1st of November, I posed a question to the ag critic from the PC party that maybe he needs to ask the government, what are they going to do if they impose this new legislation and things go wrong? Because we're not far from 100% now, and we're afraid that we're going to have an even more of an animal welfare issue if they impose these regulations than we would if they don't do anything. Another year, another comment on traceability regulations. First I remember talking about traceability was in 2004, and the comment from the federal government was that that was coming next year. Their comment in October was it's coming next year. We thought we had got with CFIA where we wanted to be as a cattle industry. We'd come up with a workable solution. They'd agreed that we could work on some of the read-out, read-in methods. We didn't need total traceability from pasture to pasture, field to field. And at some point, CFIA's Agriculture Department handed traceability over to CFIA's Food and Health Department, and we've taken a step backwards. From their perspective, traceability includes the food part of it, and it needs to be fully traceable. So we're back to square one, basically, with how we think this should work. BFO's position has always been that producers can't eat the cost of this. This is something that needs to be done. Consumers are demanding it, but we can't pay. The food guide was touched on a little bit this morning, too. We spent a lot of time in Ottawa lobbying that. Our concerns stemmed from comments about red meat not being good for the environment because of the raising process. We pointed out to some of the people that we talked to in Ottawa that your health ministry is saying beef is bad for the environment, your environment ministry is saying grasslands and beef production will help save the environment. So changes are coming. We've asked them to just include red meat and meat proteins as part of a balanced, healthy diet. They don't need to go any further than that. Dairy has taken the same position as us. They've taken quite a hit on some of the things in the food guide too. And we're all kind of leaning the same way, that just provide the information and let the consumer make the decision on how they want to eat. It's not time to tell them how they should. So after a lot of negative stuff, a positive spin was we talked about the Elora Research Station a lot over the past few years. There was no doubt it needed to be replaced. Those are not the most recent pictures because they have snow there too. But we were hoping to have cattle in the barn for this winter, but got delayed on some of the cement work. It will be opening this spring to early summer. When the cows come off grass next fall, they'll be moving straight into the new research station. So we started out with BFO made a commitment of $1.5 million. The Ontario government put in $12 million. And then we went to the federal government to get some extra funding. We accessed a program that allowed funding for equipment inside the barn. So the federal government essentially has bought some feed intake monitoring equipment, a metabolism tracker, and a methane gas chamber, measure some of the amounts of methane gas that beef cattle put out. The inside scoop is they want to do some research on different types of feeds and whether some types will produce more methane gas than others. So exciting times coming, moving forward. So for 2 years, we've run something at BFO that we like to call the Regional Marketing Initiative. A few years ago, the advisory counselors sat down with us in the summer and said they'd like to see BFO do some more marketing of beef. So we started with this kind of small project, and some of the things that we've done in the past, the second one on the list, the Hill and Knowlton research, has been a kind of a long process. It's been almost 2 years. We've got some good results from that. The top one, CPP, is the main guts of the program. It's the Collaborative Partnership Program. So that is a program where people marketing beef can apply to BFO's marketing committee, and it's a partnership. We'll help them promote beef. It's not all that complicated. I know I saw Greg Nolan here somewhere. Greg's company accessed the program, so if anybody has any questions, he'd be a good guy to ask on how he thought it worked. So the research project that we underwent was fairly large and complex. We worked with some Hill and Knowlton research. Most of it was done in the GTA, London, Kitchener-Waterloo, and a little bit in Thunder Bay so that we could get a little more broad footprint of consumers. Another project that's being done right now by a master's student is some more research into buying of protein trends with millennials. We made some recipes and did 8 videos for the internet and social media. Ontario Beef Fingerprint Research Project was, some of you have heard of Oratane. Oratane does a DNA fingerprint using the isotopes in meat, and they can come up with essentially a fingerprint that tells them if beef is where it's from, where the person selling it claims it's from. So we were intrigued by this idea. Food frauds really hit the media in the last 2 years. Some people tell us it's a problem. No one's sure how big of a problem, but this seemed like a pretty good way to find out if we have a problem with it in beef in Ontario. So last summer, they collected samples in Ontario. They collected samples in Alberta, Michigan, PEI, and Nebraska. And they studied these meat samples, and it was determined that Ontario produces a unique isotope after 120 days that proves that that is Ontario beef product. So what we've launched into now is the second step of the Oratane project. Now that we know we have, and the science has been proven in court and stood up in a vegetable case, and a shrimp case in New Zealand. So we believe we have good sound science that we can test meat. If it comes back negative for what they claim it is, it can be pursued in a legal manner. So the next step is going into retail outlets, pulling samples off of shelves, not pulling them, buying them, and doing the testing, and we'll go from there. We're not ready to put anybody in jail yet, so we don't need to go that far, but science is coming. This year, we changed the name of the Worried About Motion video series. That was something we did in partnership with Alberta beef producers. A lot of you may have heard of it when it was called Worried About hormones in beef cattle, worried about environment problems, worried. We caught on that worried is a bad word to use with consumers, so we've relaunched it called Wondering About, and so there's no new videos and new placard handouts and things through that. We did the Environmental Stewardship Video Award with last year's TESSA winner, Sandra Voss. A lot of you are familiar with our Make It Ontario Beef logo. We have the Beef Farmers of Ontario logo, which is on the display over here. It's a cow with the Beef Farmers of Ontario underneath it. Most people got that. Our consumer logo was the words Make It Ontario Beef. And through our Hill and Knowlton research, it became quite evident that consumers didn't know what that meant. So we've started to do a website and logo refresh for the consumer side. We partner with the Ontario Independent Meat Processors on a lot of things, especially in the meat and marketing of meat. So we did that at their Meeting Place conference. We hosted registered dietitian farm tours with Farm and Food Care, and we participated in Breakfast on the Farm with Dwight Foster's Feedlot and a pop-up event at Union Station in Toronto. During Ag Week, all the ag groups got together with Farm and Food Care. Beef Farmers spot was in Union Station. Dan Ferguson. We handed out beef pepperettes for the evening commute home, 3,000. During the day, there was eggs. They handed out breakfast sandwiches, I believe, and apples. So it was a pretty good, successful event. And with these farm tours and Breakfast on the Farm, a lot of the people that are involved with that are influential food bloggers and some social media people that, I think is good to have on our side. So we get a lot of positive comments out of those kind of people, especially after their first time. A lot of them have no idea what goes into raising beef, and a lot of their before and after surveys come back. They've had quite an education by the end of the day. So we talked a little bit about the Regional Marketing Initiative, which has brought us to a bold new path for Ontario beef. I mentioned in 2016 that the advisory councillors had suggested they wanted us to do some marketing. So we sat down and went through some things with them, what they thought marketing was, what they wanted to see. And in the spring of 2017, the board locked ourselves in a room for 2 days to have a strategic planning session of what we should do moving forward to help the Ontario beef industry. When it was said and done, we all came out alive, and we came out with 3 pillars that we wanted to focus on: marketing Ontario beef, producer engagement, and consumer engagement. So last year in January, we were proposing a checkoff increase to try to fund this marketing initiative. We didn't get the checkoff increase, but the advisory councillors asked us to continue using money out of reserves to run the marketing program, see if we could prove that it would work, and then we'd move on from there. In the meantime, the Ontario cattle feeders came to us and said, we've got this great product that we've promoted, Ontario corn-fed beef. We started that 15 years ago, the same way you guys are starting here. We made a lot of mistakes, we stubbed our toes, and we fell down a whole bunch of times. You don't need to do that. Why don't we get the two organizations together and we'll do this marketing thing as a whole for all of the Ontario producers? So we can now announce that we have a joint marketing committee led by Jim Clark. He will sit as the CEO of the Ontario Beef Marketing Committee. He is also the director of the Ontario Cattle Feeders Association. Our thought is that this will avoid duplication of costs and efforts so that they're not doing the same things that we're doing. We're not doubling up on anything or paying too many people to do the same thing. And this committee will sit down and it'll provide overarching support and promotion for all Ontario beef brands. I know it's a little scary bringing corn-fed into a marketing program, but they are going to fit like a brand, not as a partner. So there will be 6 members on the marketing committee, 3 members from BFO, and on December 21st, we had our December board meeting. We elected Jason Reed from Thunder Bay, cow-calf producer, Craig McLaughlin from Renfrew, a cow-calf producer, and myself from right here in Grey Bruce County to fill out the 3 spots from BFO's side. The cattle feeders are going to elect their 3 representatives at their annual meeting later this month. So the idea of the committee is that we're going to provide a business plan and a budget to both boards for their approval. After they approve that, the committee then oversees what Jim Clark and his marketing team will do with the budget. So to break down the budget, the total proposed budget for the marketing committee is $1.1 million. So to start off, we would need a checkoff increase to cover this off. When we apply for a checkoff increase to the provincial government, it can take up to 12 months for them to pass that before we can collect on it. So the cattle feeders have agreed to fully fund the marketing program until the checkoff increase would be approved by the provincial government. So it's going to break down into domestic market development is going to take $175,000 of the 1.145 million and change. And the idea of domestic market development is to expand the current beef brands, promote new ones, create new ones, and develop new products to use. There's also a global market piece to it of $175,000, and I know I mentioned that we're already in pretty good in Japan. The Japanese market is one where we learned, and it's carried over to the Canadian market, that we need more than Ontario corn-fed in the market, whether it be Japan or Ontario. We've had too many grocery stores and other meat sellers have approached saying, yeah, corn-fed beef is good, but for me to compete against corn-fed beef, I need something else. And right now, Ontario doesn't have that real something else. There are brands starting, there are people trying to make that leap, but we just need to kickstart that and provide competition amongst the meat sellers so that we provide competition within our industry. We'll continue with the regional brand program, which is kind of like the regional marketing initiative we've been doing, supporting some events where people want to go to a grocery store show, set up a booth. We'll have a bit of money to help them if they qualify for some of the guidelines. 5 minutes? Good. Domestic market development, $175,000. Global market development, $175,000. $50,000 for promotional materials, but we'll get right through all of this The biggest question we've had when we're talking about this is how is this going to affect the cow-calf producers? How are, as a cow-calf guy, going to make money? Most people can see how this is going to make the feedlot money. So we tasked one of our research analysts in the office with coming up with some facts and figures. So this graph is hard to see, but I can leave it up for a while. This shows that orange line is a record going back to January 07 of finished cattle prices. The green line underneath it is calf prices. And what history has shown us is that when fed cattle prices go up, within a 7-week time frame, calf prices go up too. So the argument that feedlot guys make all the money and they keep it all, they don't pass it on, which we'd heard but never had any research into, we've got the research now to show that this is going to help the whole industry, not just the feedlot industry. So, of course, part of it is to get the consumer to pay more for the beef. And the big question was, will the consumer pay more for the beef? And the Hill and Knowlton research has shown us that 2/3 of Ontario residents in urban areas, especially in the GTA, are willing to pay more for labeled, proven Ontario beef. This number is even higher in women, parents, citizens under 35, Ontarians born outside of Canada, and everyone in the GTA. These people are also more likely to look for information on how to cook beef and how beef is raised, and they all do it by going online. And everybody knows that there's not one untruth on the internet. So we need to get ahead of this. Our industry's been reactive too long. We're trying to be proactive. We need to be out in front so that when a consumer says to his buddy in a restaurant, I heard all beef is raised with hormones and that's not good, this guy can say, wait a minute, that's not what I read. That's not what the beef farmers said. So I think it's time for us to get out ahead of these issues. Producer engagement is another piece. We've done the BFO Up webinars. That's to engage and work with young producers. We want to identify mentors across the province who can work with these new and young entrants. We're looking for ways to link up farmers that are having trouble getting into the business with people that are trying to get out of the business. We want to ramp up some of the calf marketing clubs and regional management clubs, grazing clubs. We want to enhance the Ontario cow breeder loan program. We're looking at expansions of the community pastures, and we're going to increase the work we've been doing with the grain farmers on grazing cover crops. Consumer engagement, we've touched on that a lot. We need to reach out to the consumer via the internet. We also want to do some ongoing research to follow the trends and the consumer purchasing behaviors, make sure that we stay on top of the marketing the way we should. So that brings us to the bottom line. To fund this marketing endeavor, we're asking for an increase in provincial checkoff of $1.50 per head. So that would bring the total from $4 to $5.50. $1 of which will stay going to national levy. $1.25 of the $1.50 will go straight to the marketing budget. 25 cents is staying at BFO to be earmarked as producer and consumer engagement. What I want to point out on the national checkoff is that we've seen a lot of confusion around what gets funded from the national levy. National levy funds research and the national marketing. Canada Beef, marketing, BCRC research. There's a lot of confusion about CCA. Canadian Cattlemen's Association gets funded out of the $3 provincial portion, not out of the $1 national. It always has, and it will continue to be. We fund CCA's operations and the legal assessment for trade disputes out of the provincial $3. So that gives, what, 30 seconds for
Yep,
questions?
put that.
Good.
Yep. Any questions for Rob?
Yeah, the question is, why do we pay so much for the CFIA tags? Back to traceability. I wish I had a really good answer for that. The only answer I can come up with is that the Canadian Cattle Identification Agency somehow worked out the agreement with CFIA. CFIA chose which companies would make the tags and which tags we're allowed to use, and they set the price on us. It's not supposed to be legal. I guess you'd say it's capitalism at its finest. I don't like it. I wish they would spend some more time and money of that $4.25, I think it is a tag, researching how to make those tags stay in. That falls on deaf ears a lot. The only thing I can see that the tags are expensive is to fund this traceability initiative that's taken since 2014. It's expensive because they keep people employed.
Question over here.
When are they going to take this teething out of business?
Unfortunately, CFIA's decided they aren't going to take teething out.
That's the worst thing that has ever get in it,
They've
and the stupidest.
it hasn't worked out the way we'd like it to, that's for sure. I mean, we went through birth date reporting to try to get away from that. But CFIA and the OMAFRA inspectors have decided that the surest way to determine a calf's age is by the presentation of its teeth. And they're getting it wrong on occasion, but that's,
Different breeds get their teeth younger. And
Any other questions? Looks good. Thanks, Rob.
yep, thank you.
Appreciate that. Okay, well, we're getting our next speaker up and going. Some of the sponsors today, both the morning break was sponsored by EC King Contracting. The one will be coming up here next was sponsored by BMO. And like I said, the meal was West Grey Premium. So these are all the sponsors helping to keep the show or the day at a reasonable cost. Next up, we have, where am I here? Market update is Steve Duff. He's a chief economist from OMAFRA. He comes from a dairy and beef background in Northumberland County. He completed a Master's of Ag Economics at the University of Guelph. He joined OMAFRA in '97, and after a year as policy researcher with the Dairy Farmers of Ontario for close to 15 years, Steve was OMAFRA's lead on business risk management programs such as agri-stability and crop insurance. He's currently OMAFRA's chief economist, and I'm just going to get him to come up here and speak.
All right. Thanks very much. All right. Everybody hear me okay? All right, great. So thanks for having me out. I was asked to do a bit of an outlook for the sector, so I know it was beef day, but I wanted to cover off a little bit on hogs and grains as well. I believe there's going to be copies of the presentation passed around. Some of the print's a little small. If anybody wants bigger print of it, just let me know. You can email me and I'll send you a copy. All of the information by and large is public information on the ministry's stat site anyways. I'm going to talk a fair bit about the U.S. We'll talk a bit about the Canadian Ontario market situation, and we'll do a little bit of an outlook in that. There's a few things, and I know that the previous speaker talked about some of the trade agreements, and my title includes international trade stuff, so I'll kind of cover that as we go. I think one of the things that is important to remember when we think about what the market's going to look like is taking a really heavy look at what's going on in the U.S. They set the market for us in the vast majority of commodities, and so we really got to start there. From a policy point of view, the U.S. just signed their Farm Bill, so for the 2018 Farm Bill, which will last for another 4 years. Hasn't been a ton of press about it. The president, I think, has taken away some of the press that would normally come out about the Farm Bill. A couple of key things I think to remember from a Canadian point of view when it comes to the U.S. Farm Bill. First of all is that the U.S. Farm Bill tends to reflect the political circumstance of the United States. When things are relatively flat, when they're worried about the budget, when they're worried about expenditure, it'll usually just say agriculture or farm in the title, and that's what it is right now. If you look back in history, when there's a problem, when they're in a war in Iraq, for example, it would reflect something like freedom, or it would reflect conservation, or a number of things. The title tends to reflect the way they're approaching the world. And the last two farm bills have effectively been that. They need to keep their budgets down. They're interested in letting the markets play, and they're by and large staying out of the markets when it comes to primary ag commodities. And so from a Canadian point of view, one of the biggest things about that is that the non-recourse loan programs, which still exist in the United States, which are not a whole lot different than our advanced payment program here, in particular for corn and soybeans, the levels for them have been set really low. In the 80s, those levels were quite high. And that would have resulted in basically at times right now where grain prices are starting to fall, the U.S. government would have owned a lot of crop. As a result, farmers would have defaulted on the loans, government owns the crop, government's got to sell the crop. And that's a big thing from a Canadian point of view. When the U.S. isn't in that game, the markets are going to be more volatile within a year. And I'm going to talk about that as we go. But it also means that between years, so between crop years, things are generally less volatile. Prices tend to be a bit flatter, and I'm going to cover that off. So that's pretty significant from a Canadian point of view. And from my end, and watching what the U.S. was doing, that was one of the key things to keep in mind. So what's the U.S. market situation and outlook look like? So I think one of the key things about the U.S. continues to be, and this is important as Canadians because of the location of our market, because of the interaction in our markets, they're the world driver when it comes to agri-food, both really in terms of production, food processing, trade, pretty much across the board. And I think in general, as you look across their sector, whether it be in meats and grains and fruits and vegetables, they are consistently moving into record numbers every year. And that's a function of the fact that their population continues to grow. So at the same time they're feeding this large population, this population of people that has big incomes, like Canadians, they're also needing to and meeting the demand for a variety of different countries, in particular, worldwide. And I'm going to talk about that from the trade point of view, et cetera, as we go through. And certainly from a meat point of view, whether you're a beef producer, poultry producer, et cetera, they're hitting record levels. And not just record levels in terms of overall production, but in terms of productivity, per unit production, and that's significant. One of the other things I think that if we're going to look for a couple minutes at beef specifically, then I'll do pork, and then we'll look at grains. Their cow herd bottomed in 2014. I think one of the things that's completely different about the U.S. and the way it operates from a production point of view is that due to feed constraints, they can oftentimes significantly short their market. If you look at 2014, I'm going to show a graph here in a second. It really started in 2011, right around the time U.S. ethanol policy started up, which was part of a previous farm bill, which was part of their efforts in Iraq, et cetera, and part of their efforts to become more self-sufficient when it comes to oil. The U.S. cow herd bottomed, not necessarily because of market prices, but because of drought. The United States has whole areas of Texas, the parts of the South, where it's entirely conceivable that they can sell off an entire county's worth of cows because of lack of feed. We don't experience the same type of thing in the Canadian context. We will have examples where people have to take cattle off pasture a lot sooner. We will see reductions in numbers at times because of lack of feed. but we don't see the big drops like the U.S. does. And to a large degree, that event that started in 2011-12, it bottomed in 2014 and turned around to a large degree because of this next slide, which is the U.S. Drought Monitor. So you can go online, many of you maybe have done this, but you can go online and get this map for any basically week throughout the year in the United States. The one on the left represents, if I remember correctly, June of 2011. And as you can see, there's that red area. The red area represents severe drought, the major cattle, calf-producing regions in the United States. That led to a significant amount of the reduction in the cow herd at the same time that the rest of that green area was seeing record crops, record production, and an increase in demand because of ethanol. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We can flip forward through to 2018. So this is one of the more recent drought monitors. And you can see the white area basically represents ample amounts of rainfall and moisture. We've seen a turnaround in feed, and as a result, that's buoyed that increase in the number of cattle in the United States. A point of contention for us, an area of concern, which I'll talk a little bit about, a little less because of the focus on cattle and hogs here, but that left side of the United States is the major fruit and vegetable producing area, and that's having a big impact on food prices around the world, and in particular here in Canada, where we are so dependent on imports. So there's a few slides here which basically have the U.S. supply disposition. I put them in here so that if there was a printout, because I knew there would be, you guys can look at them, use them as a bit of a reference. But one of the things that you tend to see in the United States numbers in terms of their estimates over the next number of years is a big emphasis on exports. One of the things that the U.S., as I mentioned, pretty much across the board has a continued focus on is export markets. And one of the issues that we've dealt with the NAFTA agreement to a large degree as we went through this last couple of years is the fact that Canada over the last couple of years has gotten more into the export market, in particular for skim milk powder on a worldwide basis. And that's bothered the Americans because we aren't normally in that game with them. And so it's caused a number of issues, but that issue basically permeates all of the commodities that are produced in the United States. It's all about feeding their domestic population, and because they need to do that at a low price, at a cheap price, they've always got too much. And when you got too much, you got to sell it to somebody else. And so the export market becomes that vehicle, and it really doesn't matter what commodity you're dealing with. And you can see that in the data set. And one of the things the United States really got scared with when it comes to beef production in particular, in through that period of around 11, 12, 13, is they started to basically get priced out of export markets, and they also started to get priced out of their own domestic market. They were losing domestic share because the price of beef was going up quite a bit. And I know that's always an ongoing discussion in the beef sector, more so than many other sectors, is how do we get a higher value for our animal? But the reality is that the United States, to a large degree, priced themselves out of even their own market during that period of time. And that also contributed to the push for increased productivity, and it resulted in the push to bring the number of cows back significantly. You can see basically on this chart, and again, you probably can't as easily on your handouts because the printing is pretty small, but you've got a few key things. You've got an inventory number for beef cows, which is continuing to rise out through to 2021. That only means one thing: more beef, lower potential on market prices, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. You'll also notice, though, there's a bit of a flattening of prices relative to maybe some of the past years you would have seen, and a lot of that stems from the fact that they have a big emphasis on export markets, and I'll talk a little bit about where that plays out for Canada here in a second. Switching to hogs. Hogs obviously is a big commodity from the Canadian context. It's a big one in Ontario, even bigger in Western Canada. It is very much an export-focused industry. It's one that has significant access from a Canadian point of view to other markets. It's something I think that beef probably could learn a fair bit from in terms of being able to access higher value markets, etc., around the world. The U.S. sow herd bottomed in late 2013. Grain prices had a big contributing factor to that, but so did the PED crisis in their context that resulted in significant reductions in sow numbers. The one thing we've seen since that period is a significant increase, and to some degree, the nature of the way the U.S. is focusing on exports the way that the sector is becoming more integrated, where they're a lot more tied directly to processors. The way that the U.S., if you look at the numbers, is moving closer and closer to a full fair-to-finish model like we have in Canada, as opposed to farrowing and then nursery barns and then finishing barns, is leading them to a scenario where I think the cycle becomes less pronounced. It's more a function of how can producers continue to become highly efficient. And you can see that basically in this litter rate calculation. I think one of the challenges with the beef industry in general, whether it be in the United States or in Canada, is a lot more difficult to create and get this kind of information on productivity. It's not an easy thing in the cattle industry in Canada to get basically pounds a day per gain from a statistical point of view, right? Anybody that feeds cattle has some idea of it, but there isn't the public information measured the way that the U.S. has or the way Canada does for hogs. And so productivity has grown quite a bit, as you can see that drop obviously from PED. The thing that, I'll talk about that in a minute, the thing about Ontario, but the real thing I think that's really interesting about the way Canada and the U.S. responded is how quickly their productivity regained itself after such a severe problem. And one of the things that the sector collectively in North America, and if you read the farm press, there's a lot of discussion about it right now, is African swine fever and the impact that it has or could have on both the demand and production of pork in China and Asia, moving into Europe, and what would happen if it gets here. It's a completely different thing than PED, and it's a different thing than we've experienced in the past, and so it's something that we're keeping a close eye on. Pork in the U.S., pretty much the same context. I think the difference really becomes the gestation period's a lot quicker, which means that they can turn things around a lot quicker. It's more contained, which means it's not focused on the weather from a feedstuff point of view. It doesn't have a grazing period, which means you're not necessarily dealing with lack of grazing period as a way to support feed production. But the basic concepts are the same. The one trickier part, I think, about the pork industry in the United States, which is similar to, say, chicken or turkey, is it's a lot more integrated. The processors own a lot more animals all the way through the value chain like they do in poultry, whereas in the Canadian context, it's not the same level. And as you can see, a fairly big increase, quite a large increase, in fact, in total hog inventory estimated over that period. And so that's a pretty significant thing and something that we keep a close eye on. On the grain side of things, I think there's a few key things to think about from both a production and a policy point of view. So the policy, the big one in my view, is that non-recourse loan program. It's documented right in the Farm Bill what the support rates are for that. As long as the U.S. keeps those support rates low, things are good from our point of view, and the likelihood of the U.S. government owning corn or beans is very low, and that in turn means that there's going to be some more stability between crop years. The one thing that's gotten tricky in the context of U.S. production, in corn in particular, is that of ethanol. One, because it's created a demand, a fixed level demand in the balance sheet. So when I go over the supply disposition for corn in the second, the tricky thing about ethanol is it's there. It's tied to gasoline and diesel production, obviously, and those things don't change a whole lot. They tend to just sort of go like this with the economy. And so if there's a mandate, whether or not you can move around that mandate or not, those numbers are going to stay pretty fixed. And there's a greater incentive in the system for production to move towards ethanol, for corn to move towards ethanol, and then everything else after that sort of sorts itself out. And that's where you get into feed, you get into seed production, all that other kind of type of industrial use. The thing that is interesting about the U.S. is they've got themselves to the point where they feel the mandate is at the level they want, right? So as a result, that's put a fixed level of demand in the market that, at least for the foreseeable future, isn't changing. Every once in a while it gets discussed about maybe we should lower the ethanol standard because there's concerns about the cost, the impact that has on the price of gasoline in the United States. But if you look at demand in the United States for gasoline and diesel, the U.S. probably more than any other country has historically and is continuing to show that they can adjust themselves pretty well when they face high prices. I will give the Americans credit in that regard. They do have the ability to adjust themselves, and as a result, the markets adjust with it. So if you look at corn supply and demand, I think one of the key things about the supply disposition in this chart, compared to if you were to go back 20 years or back even 10 years, is really the ethanol. It's fixed in that context within that supply disposition, or it's not changing a whole lot. And the other thing is that the movement of stocks between years, even though it's growing, those stocks are owned by the market. They're not owned by the government. And that is a fundamentally different thing. You've got thousands of elevators, thousands of grain handlers owning that crop as opposed to one entity. And so how it goes onto the market, how it's used, is completely different. And so as a result, one of the things that you can see in these charts, if you look at that bottom line, which is the average farm price for corn, it's considerably flatter than those same stocks-to-use ratios would have reflected in the past. And the reason being is that markets are adjusting to deal with those from one year to the next. And so one thing I will point out on this chart, it applies the same with soybeans, is that, and again, and this is quite different, I think, from Canada, is that from one year to the next, the United States can adjust millions of acres, millions and millions of acres, in or out of production on relatively small price changes. Canada, generally speaking, Ontario also, we're always producing at capacity. We've got 12 million acres of produced farmland in Ontario, for example, 9.5, 10 million in crop production, 2.5 example in corn. Generally speaking, we're producing that from one year to the next. We're always producing at the maximum. But the United States, despite being considerably larger, has significant amounts of land that aren't necessarily marginal, but they can easily set aside because producers are producing with a thinner margin. The rent numbers are different, which I'll talk about. And as a result, if you look last year as an example, the USDA put out their outlook very similar to this, and this one here was as of October 2018. When they do their USDA Outlook conference, which happens in late February, they'll put out a new one of these. And for 2019-20, that's the crop year that'll be planted next spring, between that presentation, that date in February, and their planting intentions report, which happened about maybe 6 weeks later, there was a drop of in the neighborhood of 10 million acres overall in production because of estimated changes in prices. So if you read the market press right now, there's discussion that soybean prices in the U.S. have come back up a little bit in the last couple weeks because the U.S. is talking to China a little bit more. The difference in the Canadian context is we're always going to be producing in that neighborhood of acres where the U.S. can adjust. And when the government's out of the game, that adjustment in acres happens more and more responsibly, okay? And that's what's keeping the prices a lot more flat between production years. So the things to watch for in the U.S. basically become where do they expect acreage to go and what happens with production. Is there a drought or is there a bumper crop? That's the thing that drives prices more so than even trade or government policy. One of the things that's happened to the U.S. as they've had issues with China is that it's given them opportunities in other areas. So in the process of basically shorting the market worldwide with soybeans and some of the challenges that have come up with that, it's because corn prices have fallen a bit, it's given them some more market opportunities. And you can see they've had some export opportunities that grow here. One of the things about being tied to the U.S. in the way we are is that when the U.S. has increased opportunities on most commodities and other markets, because our production is very similar, maybe not the same cost structure, but the nature of our production is very similar, that also in some ways opened up markets for us, at least from a knowledge and a transfer point of view, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Soybeans, very similar. I think one of the challenges with the U.S. will be China and what happens in the next little while. The reality is, however, is that China is in a situation where they have, a very large portion of the world's population and a very small percentage of the arable land. So you can only hold out on price for so long when you need to feed yourself. And that's, I think, one of the challenges that the U.S. has thrown over China, which in the short term maybe doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but in the medium to longer term probably is effective. The one thing that's, again, you have to understand about the United States, it's one of the few countries in the world that in the context of what people want to eat today can feed itself, right? As Canadians, we can feed ourselves, but if we're going to do it for an extended period of time and rely on ourselves, we're not eating the same thing. And that's not easy for populations in today's world economy to deal with. It's a much different thing. It was a much different thing 100 years ago. People had less expectation. They had less knowledge of what others had opportunities for or access to, and it changes the way people approach things. Rightly or wrongly, that's the situation we're in. And so that's where the U.S. has some advantage in that regard. You can see they've had a big drop in exports, but they've went into some other markets. And so the reality is that they have a quality product, a low-cost product, and they have transportation networks to supply product. And there's countries around the world that can pick that up. So it's not as absolute as what some of the media has presented. So in terms of specific things about international trade issues, I've tried to cover off a few of those. Again, the U.S. sets the world markets, by and large. They struggle with it. They struggle with some of the relationship with Brazil in particular with soybeans. But the reality is they're the dominant exporter. They're not unlike Canada in that overall they're about 20% of their total farm production, but for some commodities they're over 50%. So if you look at soybeans, in any one year they're in the neighborhood of 50% is exported. You get into cotton or almonds or other commodities like that, various nuts and things, which again are large in the United States. Like they're large commodities. They're exporting 100% of them, 99% of them. So they're able to produce things that they don't need a lot of themselves, but they are very competitive in doing so. And so it really comes down to this, the second bullet point is the world needs U.S. ag exports. And I would argue the world needs them more than the U.S. needs those exports, quite honestly, in the long run. That's important. Whether we want to admit it or not, it's true. And as my earlier point, China has 19% of the world's population and 5% of the arable land. So I think that one of the challenges in dealing with trade problems in today's world, as more and more countries move towards free trade, it becomes more about how do you get along. In the past, it was about who could put on the largest tariff or who could put on the biggest import quota or who could put the biggest barrier to the type of product, et cetera, we wanted. When you're in a free trade environment, it's really about how do we get along. Because the economies have become so integrated, there's no opportunity really in the medium to long term to start throwing on tariffs the way some things have had. And I think that's pretty important. But with that, the U.S. is losing competitive ground. They're losing competitive ground in a couple areas. One is their general wage rates are going up like the rest of the developed world, right? And as wage rates go up, as standards of living go up, things become more costly, right? And when things are more costly, you basically compete yourself out of certain markets. And that's the reality of the situation. The U.S. has a much bigger problem with Mexico in many areas, Ottawa as an example, than they do with Canada. Well, why is that? Well, because Mexicans earn a lot less. Their standard of living is a lot less. They don't work any better, but they get paid less. And so as a result, there's that. You see it in, Linamar in Guelph, the biggest employer in the city of Guelph, has plants in Kentucky, has plants in Mexico. Same concept, right? They're diversifying their labor force, et cetera. The thing that's gotten tricky about the United States, and I don't necessarily think it slowed down because of Trump, but it's kind of where they've moved, is they went through a pretty rapid, and this graph basically shows the free trade agreements that they've entered into over the last, since 1970. And it shows the free trade agreements that they went into and U.S. agri-food exports. And it's grown significantly. And those free trade agreements have allowed them to get in there because they've got a competitive product. The free trade agreement gave them lower or zero tariffs in many cases. And if I were to overlay, Canada's would look very similar. The difference is that the United States has kind of stopped, right? They got into South Korea a year before us. So we're in a free trade agreement with South Korea right now, but they got in 1 year ahead of us. So if we're shipping beef to South Korea, the tariff rates on the U.S. product is one sort of stair step lower than ours. They're already a bit lower cost production than us, so that's a real disadvantage for us. But they've sort of stopped. They started negotiating with Europe, and then Trump came in, and nobody gets along with Trump. And they started into CPTPP, or the Trans-Pacific, and then they bowed out of that. They tried to renegotiate, and they did it, it seems successfully, with South Korea in a couple different ways. But if you look at what Canada's approaching, rightly or wrongly, and there are flaws with free trade agreements, I'm not trying to stand up here and say there aren't, but the reality is that we're moving forward more rapidly with some of those things. So the point about Japan is very important. We're ahead of them now in that regard. We may be 2 or 3 steps ahead of them in that regard. Combine that with the fact that maybe we're seen as easier to get along with. Maybe that's changed, I don't know, but it could very well be the case. I'll give you a good example. If you might have read about it in the Ontario Farmer, there's been a lot of press about it. There's a baby formula plant for the dairy sector in Kingston, and it's from China. I've met with them. And one of the key aspects of that plant is the fact that, in general, they prefer dealing with Canada over the U.S. in a variety of different things. It doesn't necessarily mean that's going to last for the long term. We still got to work on that relationship with them. But, all of those things play into that. And I do think that it puts the U.S. at a disadvantage in the longer term relative to Canada, but it doesn't change the fact that the world needs them. They need them a lot more than they need us. And so it doesn't mean that we're going to move ahead of them, but it means it gives us some room to get into some markets. Trade doesn't happen. The beef farmers of Ontario don't trade beef. Businesses, firms trade beef, right? So if this gives an opportunity for firms to get in there, a bit of breathing room to get a market set, all that is good in the longer run for us, given the fact that we are, again, a price taker to the United States, and there's a variety of things, I think, that come from that. So in terms of our food situation, and understanding a little bit about that, food prices in Canada have generally exceeded the rate of inflation. That isn't necessarily the case in the United States. Food prices in the U.S. have actually dropped a fair bit in the last little while. We haven't in Canada. Now, it's a function of a variety of things. The biggest one really is that as a high-income country, we are demanding and wanting a lot of things that we don't produce, and it happens to be that the things we demand and want are produced in the United States in areas where there's drought and where transportation costs are rising, where labor costs are rising, and so we're paying more for it. So that food inflation, if you will, is a bit of our own doing. It's a bit of the fact that the population, and the point about, I think it's a really important one, are people in the GTA willing to pay more for beef? Yeah, and think in general they are. I think that's the same for just about anything. It doesn't mean you shouldn't promote that from a beef point of view, but they're willing to pay because they have incomes to do so. But at some point that stops. And I think that's one of the challenges where in the Canadian context we have to be careful. When the price of hydro is going up, when the price of education and everything else is going up, as everybody knows very well of, that becomes an issue at a point. I've been doing this job for a long time. There was a point in time where we never got questions about food prices. We get a lot of them now. Now, it doesn't mean it's a problem necessarily, but it means people are thinking about it. And to the point earlier about worried about or wondering about, those are two different things, but people are wondering, and they don't understand. And they don't understand the difference. The number of questions that we get about why we don't produce certain things, to me, boggles my mind. But the fact that people ask the question tells me they need to be better educated. It isn't the fact that they don't know any better or that they're not smart people. It's just the world is different. And if you still happen to have some involvement in agriculture, like presumably everybody in this room does, we're in a big advantage compared to the rest of the people who buy and consume food every day in this province. And that is essential to my point of view of understanding where food prices are going. From a demand point of view, meat demand continues to grow. There's a lot of discussion about per capita. There's a lot of discussion about substitution, and certainly, we've seen periods of time where beef prices spike, so demand drops off because there are alternatives. But the reality is the population grows, incomes are growing, and people are consuming more and more protein in general, and they're consuming more lean protein, which is another piece within that. And I know there's always the discussion about various types of lean protein and chicken versus beef and all that kind of stuff, but it is something to consider, recognizing that there are differences in availability, that kind of stuff. So what have we seen from a cow herd point of view? Lowest level in 20 years. We had a short-lived expansion nationally for 2 years, and our numbers have continued to drop off. It's a complicated thing, this idea of cow herds, even sow herds in the Canadian context versus the U.S. There's so many other factors at play beyond the pure economics of beef cattle prices, especially in Ontario, and I think that's one of the challenges that we face. Again, given this idea of the land's always going to be used, it's just a question of what are we using it for. And if it's, in this area is probably as good an example of anything. If it's not pasture, it's corn. If it's not corn, it's going to be something else. And over time, that changes. The likelihood of you know, the land in certain areas of the province going from pasture to corn has increased a lot over the last number of years, and it's not just because of the price of corn. It's because of changes in technology, it's changes in the genetics of corn, equipment. There's a whole bunch of things that have contributed towards that. There's a few things I think that are important to consider from the Ontario point of view. In terms of slaughter, our numbers have risen to quite significantly in the last little while. If you break down the data more detailed, we have this all on our ministry stat site, a fair amount of that is due to cow slaughter, okay? That is a challenge in some respects. It's also an opportunity in others. On one hand, right, that creates competition for hook space, for feedlot cattle. On the other side of it, it's providing a lower price alternative for some people in the economy for beef, and that in turn increases beef demand. So there's a balancing act that's tricky about that. We've seen a fall in the number of feeder cattle from Western Canada overall in terms of the total slaughter. That's partially because of the cow numbers. It's also because of difficulty in getting those cattle, and it's also due to relative profit, which I'll talk about that. And as we've seen, we had some pretty high, record high prices from a slaughter point of view, whether you do it on the rail or live, depending on the source you use, and we've seen a drop off of that. So when you have fewer cattle, but you have growing demand for beef, as many of you guys are quite aware, I'm sure, one of the things that we've seen is a pretty big increase in carcass weights, and you can see this in the hog sector too. This is really per unit yield. I could put a corn graph over the same thing, and it's yield per unit is really the idea. And so that was a growing number. This last year was the first year in a long time we actually saw a drop off. And I think there is a limit to how big cattle can get from a feedlot perspective. Certainly during the BSE crisis, you know, there's a lot of discussion about how big can cattle get before we have problems, and we certainly took cattle to a lot bigger levels than I think a lot of people, certainly from my perspective at the time, believed we could, without the negative health consequences necessarily we first believed in. But we seem to have hit that limit. The interesting thing will be when the 18 data is fully realized and evaluated how that plays out. In terms of slaughter cattle basis, I think there's a couple of key things about this. One is that the basis, again, which is the difference between the prevailing Ontario price and the Chicago futures, for the last number of years has followed trend and stuck fairly close to averages. So I'll talk a little bit about forecasting and some of the work we do for programs, et cetera, here in a second. But we've been pretty close on that. So if you were somebody that follows the market regularly, we have weekly prices on our ministry site that derive from the BFO prices, so you can get all of these charts are right off our ministry's website. So everybody has access to them if they want. We've stuck fairly close to a 5-year average, 10, et cetera, where we've seen a bit of divergence. That purple line, which is the one without the circles or squares on it, is 2018, and we've seen a fairly big divergence from that at the end of this past year, so the end of 2018, as cow slaughter has went up. And I think that's reflectant of, you know, some fairly ample supply, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the challenges with that. I think one of the things that's tricky about Ontario agriculture in general, which I think is important to understand, is we always have excess demand. It doesn't matter what commodity you're talking about. Generally speaking, we don't have enough round to fill the market. So we're always importing. And whether it's fruits and vegetables, or when I do stuff on economic development with local communities, it's, well, you know, there's just about anything, really. If you can find a market for it, there's a market for just about anything, because we don't produce enough of any of it. And beef is no different. But the difference, I think, with beef is that from a marketing point of view, you know, we don't normally, at least in major grocery stores, et cetera, have a great distinction from a consumer point of view from imported beef and Canadian beef. And it's a function of a variety of things, and it reflects in the fact that we're importing such a large amount of the beef in Ontario, at least 50%. Now it's dropped back off a little bit, but it's a significant number. Now, it's unrealistic to think that's ever going to go to zero, right? But it doesn't mean you can't eat into it. And I think that's one of the key aspects from a marketing point of view. And again, every percentage is really, from my perspective, an opportunity for the Ontario beef sector. It's that. And if you can find a way to dig into that, you're good. But it's not for everybody, and not everybody can afford to pay more for beef. Not everybody understands the difference, and you can market it, et cetera, and I completely agree with that. But that number is really the key. This is an interesting scenario, the feeder calf basis, and there's discussion about marketing and how that affects cattle prices, and it does. The analysis that the BFO did is exactly right. If you add value on the feedlot end, it gives you greater potential for higher cattle prices. But I think the thing to remember about cattle prices, hog prices are very similar, but cattle prices in particular, is that there is no such thing as a board price. So if any of you follow the market for corn or soybeans, which I assume you do, you can go and get the farm market news, and it tells you what elevators all across Ontario are offering for a standard unit of corn or beans or wheat, feed grains, etc. at any point, any day of the week through the year. That doesn't exist in livestock. And one of the reasons it doesn't exist in livestock is there's no such thing as a standard unit. That's a big part of it. What that means is that when you go to sell cattle, when you go to buy cattle, all you really know is what you're looking for, what you can afford to pay, and what prices were the day before. That doesn't mean that any of those things will prevail the next day. And when you throw onto the fact that the majority of feeder cattle in this province, at least the domestically produced one, or the Ontario produced ones, are sold through auction, that means that you can have a lot more variability. It doesn't mean it's a bad system. It just means it's a different set of risk. And one of the things that's really picked up in, I think, is the feeder calf basis over the last number of years. And so I pointed out specifically the slaughter cattle basis and being close to average or close to trend, because it has been. And from an understanding the market point of view and thinking about what you might get for your product or how you might price accordingly, it's been a good indicator. But if you use the 5-year average feeder basis on stocker cattle and you were selling in any market in Ontario over the last number of years, you would have been way, way underestimating what you would have received. And if you're a feedlot operator, you would have been way, way underestimating what you would have paid. Bottom line. And that was, from my opinion, from a variety of different reasons. One of which I think is that goes back to that earlier slide. We've got excess demand. So everybody wants to find a way to increase the amount of beef we can produce. But I think one of the things that this graph severely understates is the fact that, in my view, there is no standard unit of beef production. Every animal out there is different. And as a result, in some ways, it's not really good for me to get up here and present you an average, because the average is almost meaningless in a lot of ways. But it is the way you have to kind of go about this stuff. Whereas with corn, that's not the same thing. And so what I've observed and what I think has become, one is we've seen a flattening of the basis, which means it's gotten weaker, which means that the desire of feedlots or whomever that's buying cattle in these auctions, by and large across the province, to pay higher amounts for cattle is dwindling. It's not just because of more beef supply in the United States. In fact, it's probably the opposite. It's because of the fact that the feedlots are facing tighter margins, they're facing tighter challenges on the pricing side, and there's less competition. They're all seeing it, and so that's driving the basis down. But the one thing that I've noticed, and I've talked to a few people about it and I've seen it, I've experienced it too, is the price range in a lot of sales this past fall has really widened. The idea of cattle, even weaker cattle, if you will, maybe cattle in smaller numbers, not necessarily uniform condition, that kind of thing, they're getting really discounted. Whereas in the last 3 or 4 years, they probably got a pretty good price. Some people didn't even really realize they were discounted. They were, but not a whole lot. Now they're really getting discounted. And I think it is a function of that. Now, is it the same people buying those cattle as it has been in the past few years? I don't think so either. I think it's different people buying, people who want smaller numbers, people who are okay with cattle that aren't as conditioned because they're doing some other business model that isn't putting them into groups of 60 in a pen, but it's reflecting in the numbers. I don't think that's going away. So that is an issue, I think, that has the potential for the beef industry to consider, because on one hand, it was good from a profitability point of view for a lot of people over the last few years. On the flip side, a lot of people didn't change their behavior as a result. And so it doesn't necessarily mean they're bad producers. It just means they're probably getting overpaid for their animals. Now, you take that and you run with it, right? But they need to understand that that could change in the future. And when you're taking a whole year's worth of cash revenue into a sale, and you're walking out And you'll just see how it goes, because that's the way an auction works, right? And things are getting discounted and you don't anticipate it, that's a problem. Now, it's not like people haven't experienced that in the past. It's not like that we won't experience it in the future. But in my view, it is something that's different than we've seen in the last few years. And I think we need to at least consider it in terms of, and I look to the BFO because I think it is one of the things that they've continued to promote, and I think they need to keep promoting. And that is this idea of better conditioned cattle, more consistent cattle, larger groups, special sales, all that kind of thing. So I'm a big proponent of that. Sow herd productivity. Again, just to flip the hogs really quickly, we continue to outpace the U.S. This is one of the examples where I think Canada, and Ontario in particular, is better than the United States pretty much across the board. We are considerably more productive in producing hogs than the United States on a productivity basis. Are we a lower cost? Not necessarily, because we're not of the same scale, but our producers are world-class from a productivity point of view. Our dairy industry is very similar. We may not have the same scale as the United States, but there's a reason all the world countries came to us for genetics for so long, right? You don't have to be big to be good, and that's been basically the scenario for these two sectors. Our hog slaughter numbers declined, have started to increase. One of the real challenges we face, which is both a challenge and an opportunity, is we saw the closing of quality meat packers a few years ago, which helped the other packers. It allowed them to get better scale, to scale up. It also meant, though, that we had more hogs going to Quebec. And as you can see, that blue line, the number of hogs going to Quebec is quite large. It's about 1.5 million hogs a year. That's a large number of hogs. And if you look at the swine fever scenario, for example, depending on how that kind of stuff plays out, we don't have capacity in Ontario to process those hogs. So again, it's a different kind of scenario than cattle, where there is excess capacity. So again, similar challenges, but different approaches. The basis for hogs basically has been very consistent. A lot of the market push from a price point of view has been for quite some time simply where the U.S. is going. Lower prices, bigger supplies. The one thing where Canada has shown some real opportunity, I think, and you can see it in the data. This chart is for, and again, if you're a hog producer, you'll know it, or if you follow the market. This basis chart is for 100 index pigs. If you look at, and that's fairly standard in the U.S. as well, but if you look at where our, the difference between our 100% 100 index formula price, which this drives off of, versus the price that farmers are realizing, that gap's growing. And the reason is that farmers are individually able to take advantage of carcass quality initiatives and a variety of different things, and marketing in different processes. You don't get that kind of richness in the data from the beef side. It's just simply not available. But pork, same thing. We import a lot of pork. Any opportunity to displace some of that is an opportunity, and one that hopefully we can take advantage of, but it's a different scenario. There isn't a lot of hook space for pigs in Ontario. You want to have more pigs, you got to have bigger barns, you have to have a whole other issue. It's not the same concept or model that beef faces. So let's talk crops for a second. The Ontario corn basis. Ontario corn basis is normally on an export level, which means it's negative to the U.S. That's an advantage for us. One of the things that's changed over the last few years is ethanol. We have a larger amount of ethanol here in Ontario. It's been an opportunity. It's improved the basis in some areas, which bumps up the price. You're feeding livestock, that means you're also paying more if you're having to buy corn. Or certainly, it creates a greater opportunity in that regard. And so one of the things we track fairly closely on that bottom graph is where the basis goes versus our net exports. And our net exports, when they start to drop, as you can see, they get negative, which means we're importing. On the yellow line, you can see the basis jumps way up. So that's something we have to monitor very closely. The U.S. is always export-based. They're always negative, if you will, from a cash point of view. And that gives them, from a feeding point of view, some advantages that has changed. Soybeans, very similar. You tend to go, that blue line is the top base, so that's the 5-year average. It tends to go positive, which means we're importing basically right before harvest when you run out of supply, and then it drops back down after harvest. One of the things you can notice for soybeans is that we're staying at an import level a little long, or sorry, at an export level a little longer, in the last couple of years. That's primarily because we've had a little bit less acres, we've had a better yield, and we grow a quality product, we've got more food grade, et cetera. So what are our international trade issues? I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about supply management here. I think the reality is that supply management is always going to be an issue in international trade discussions. It hadn't been to a large degree for 20 years. The United States really, I think, from a trade point of view, their concerns with supply management really hinged around the principle of it, about the fact that they're export-oriented, and about the fact that Canada has a system which has maintained itself for a long time as they've went through considerable upheaval in their dairy industry, right? They're losing dairy farms hand over fist. The scale difference in the United States is massive, and it creates basically almost a two-class system, if you will, and that's a lot of the pressure point. There's a few things I think that are important. One is that you hear, especially at beef or pork or crop meetings, you hear a lot about the WTO because we talk about free trade, but you also hear guys like me talk about the WTO from a business risk management point of view. CASE, Agri-Stability, Agri-Invest, they're all designed to try to conform with the WTO because we're a country that's trying to play by it because we're small and we want access to markets, and we figure that's the kind of the way we do it. The thing that the WTO didn't really do is it did not set a good base for free trade. It really just set up, some rules to kind of move forward by. And that's why countries like Canada are off doing one-off agreements with the European Union. We're off doing one with, the Trans-Pacific. We're off doing it with a variety of other countries. I think despite the noise that's created by NAFTA in the U.S., we're gaining competitive position. I've already talked about that. It's really, really important. I think the thing that's unique about Ontario is that 74%, and this is only going up, 74% of our exports are designed for the U.S., and most of our exports are further processed. We do not export, by and large, raw commodity like Western Canada. We're not exporting canola. We're exporting value-added product. It's because we have the population, we have the processing. So that's really the focus, I think, for us as a province is where we deal with that. So when it comes to beef, you're not sending boxed beef, you're talking about basically value-added cuts, et cetera. That tends to be the focus from an Ontario point of view. So what's the market outlook look like? This is a graph basically with corn and soybean prices projected out to the end of 2020. Again, I think the key thing really, it's not so much, years ago the corn producers had a guy named Brian Deutsch. Some of you might have remembered him. Brian would come to a meeting like this, and he was really good at it, to be frank. And he would trying to predict when he thought the low would hit, et cetera. I'm really just interested, from this purpose, is looking at where we're moving. We're seeing fairly flat because the U.S. is flat. Unless we have a big appreciation of the Canadian dollar, I don't think that's really going to change. What is interesting, I think, is these projections on the return to labor and basically farm land. And we've seen a tightening of that. In which case, so this basically represents the return to land on corn acres if you're at, the blue is if you're able to get 200 bushels to the acre, or if this is if you're able to get the provincial average. And the interesting part about that is that if you do this math, and then I go and look at the University of Guelph, who has surveys on land rental across Western Ontario, that's pretty close to what a lot of guys are paying for land rent, which means that you're hitting some pretty big yields or you're not making a penny. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't beat those, because there are people who can. But the one thing about averages, it does mean that there's somebody worse than that, right? So that is, I think, one of the things that the sector is going to face. From a cattle point of view, I think that one of the challenges here is that even though hopefully we can have some moving up of live cattle prices, feeder cattle prices are coming down as well. This graph paints a pretty negative picture. Now, this is feedlot returns, and this is on the assumption that basically you're buying all your feed. And what it does tell you, though, is that the margins, if that's the case, are really something. I'm not telling, generally speaking, I don't think I'm telling you something you don't already know. But what it does tell you is that there continues to be pressure on this. So if you're somebody with stocker cattle looking to sell into these guys, what do you think that's going to do to the price they're willing to pay, right? So it is a challenge. I don't necessarily think it's a new one. but it does continue. All I've really done here, and this information's on our website as well, is basically take nearby Chicago prices over the next few years and a 5-year average basis that goes on a weekly basis and project where that's going, and that really just says flat. The one thing I think that to consider as we move into next spring is that I do predict that there'll be less of a range up and a lot more of a range down, depending on what you're taking to market. Because again, these averages are auction-based, right, from the perspective of the basis context. Fed cattle prices, U.S. supply increasing, prices are going down. I don't see that changing from the U.S. point of view. I think our basis is going to likely weaken, which this would suggest, and I think that'll hold true. What that means is downward pressure throughout the value chain. Doesn't necessarily mean on profitable times, but it does mean that there's going to be downward pressure, which means that keeping your costs controlled and adding value are going to be the key. Hog prices, fairly similar. Some rebounding just because we have hit a bit of a low from the U.S. point of view, and their exports are going up quite a bit, so that probably gives us a little bit of buy. But the fair to finish returns are similar. If you're buying all your feed, things are stressed. And again, like I mentioned, these are world-class productivity numbers too. It's not like we're talking low productivity numbers here. So those are potentially challenging times on the market hog one, quite similar. So in terms of the highlights, I think, the reality is that production in the U.S. continues to grow. Their markets are going to be more volatile within year, right? The one challenge of the U.S. being out of these games is that within a year, the market's going to go like this, because there's no option for the U.S. government to flatten prices by buying supply. So you're going to see more volatility in Chicago than we have in the past. And I think that's been the case. Now, between years, as you move from nearby to old crop, that kind of thing, I don't necessarily think that's the case. In fact, it seems to be flattening. A weaker dollar, I haven't really talked much about that because that's really outside of our wheelhouse, but the reality is a weaker dollar's helped us. But on the flip side of it is, and this is this idea of understanding consumers, it's also meant that prices are considerably higher for the other things that people buy, right? And so that's particularly important. So as I mentioned, this is a strategy that I've been pushing for a long time. It really doesn't change. Always pushing for cost efficiencies, participating to the maximum of BRM programs. My view of it always was I don't like people having their nose against the glass when there's a problem. You may not like everything, but the reality is it's the assistance that's there. Hedging on commodity market, it's there for you. At a minimum, it can help you understand where things are going. At a maximum, it can be dangerous, depending on how you go about it. But it is a tool that's available to people to at least see where things are going. Using available market tools, which I think the BFO is on the right track in that regard and trying to help people market. You can market direct. There's a variety of different things. You don't have to sell all your stockers to an auction. You can try to set up direct contracting with a feedlot, just like they have with the packer. There's a lot of tools out there. Ensuring credit's in place before it's needed. This is a particularly big one we've seen more so in the run-up on grain prices over the last number of years as opposed to lately. The other thing that I think that the last point is the one thing, and I could do a whole hour on it, is that, the whole adage that farmers are land rich and cash poor is probably no more true than it is today. Farmers, if you look at the data, have strong net worth, but there is almost no cash in those farms across the country. Now, that varies obviously with every individual, but it's in a much different situation even than it was in the 80s if you look at the numbers. That's a good thing and it's a bad thing because it means that in a cash flow crunch, you're making adjustments with things on your business maybe you don't want to make adjustments with, which tends to be, for a lot of people, land. And so that's, I think, something to consider. That's not necessarily a new issue, but it's one I think that's building. I don't anticipate we'll see a drop in land values really for a variety of different reasons, but the reality is that I think that's a pretty big issue for a lot of people. So anyways, that's the presentation. Thanks. If there's any questions or if you want to email me, be happy to do so. So thanks very much. Sure. Yeah.
Question on bases.
Yep.
you showed the Ontario bases and then that, more in particular, the fed cattle, but you
Yep.
were referring to Chicago versus Ontario.
Yeah.
Comment on Ontario versus Alberta, and how long is that sustainable from what we're used to? Because
Yes.
we're trying to buy feeder cattle against those guys that have an extremely strong basis compared to Ontario.
Yeah, so again, I think that the basis has gotten quite strong in Alberta. I really think, again, it's a function of, I think one of the biggest differences in Alberta is that the packers operate much closer to capacity, right? So if you look at the hog example, Quebec hog processors almost always operate at capacity, which means when they start to drop low in numbers, they bid like crazy to get pigs. We don't see that in the Ontario context because our packers, and we only got a couple, they're not generally operating at capacity, so they have more room to move. Whereas in Western Canada, they've tended to be operating closer to capacity, so they're willing to keep that basis up. I think that from a competing for feeder cattle point of view, I think my perspective would be a lot of it has come back to sort of the long-standing relationship that Ontario feedlots have had with certain groups of cattle producers in Western Canada, and the validity and the value that it has for a consistent market for them that has been the advantage for many feedlots. That's sort of my view of it, but I think that the longer that gap continues, the more difficult it's going to be for us to continue to get those calves, which again is why we need to keep thinking about ways to have more cows and thus more calves here in the province. Not just, from my perspective, not just in the north. I think there's lots of places in central and eastern Ontario that aren't too far off being able to have those cows, but there needs to be some process within that. Incentives, I don't know. I'm not the one signing the checks anymore for the ministry, so it's not really my call. Christoph's probably closer to that than I am. But anyways.
Any other questions?
All right.
good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
What happened here? Okay, that brings us to our afternoon break, but so it's sponsored by BMO. Take it's 15, 20 minutes here. Go around, have fun, grab a coffee, water, whatever you need, and then we'll come back and we'll finish up with chainsaw safety. And if I could have everybody that's involved in the panel come up to the front and meet with Lori, that'd be great.
as near as I can figure. When the trees come back in their upright position, they give a catapulting effect. Each tree will run about 3 inches wide, 2.5 to 3 feet long, and we wore that lengthways into the face.
Remember, leaving Chico standing in the work area is an extremely hazardous practice. Vibrations from nearby cutting and skidder activities, or simply falling from decay, can cause a Chico to fall on a worker. But falling a tree into a Chico is still the easiest way for a cutter to be the cause of his own death. Glacier Garnier recalls his encounter with a Chico.
Well, the kind of bush was mixed poplar, birch, and spruce. It was just like it is here, probably. Kind of rough. And that black poplar had maybe 6 foot dry in the top. So when the machine hit the black poplar, the top broke off. And when the machine jumped on the stump and hit the black poplar, she all so lean on one side. Turning.
Often, it is safer and less time-consuming to remove a Chico using the skidder. The skidder should only push a Chico down after the direction of fall has been established. Then the skidder should be backed into a position that is in direct line with the Chico. Since the fair lead is at the highest point on a skidder, it can exert the most pressure and provide the best protection for the operator. So use the fair lead to provide steady pressure against the Chico fair lead.
Okay, if everybody would like to come in and pick up a seat, we'll get rolling again. Okay, as everyone's coming in to sit down, we're going to start with a little farm safety. Today is going to be about chainsaw safety. Pretty much everybody here that has a farm or some property, chances are you have some trees, and chances are at some point those trees have a limb or two, or maybe the whole tree that needs to come down. So we've got a fella here, Ken Goldsmith. He's worked for the MNR for 21 years, worked with Bruce County for 16. He's a professional chainsaw instructor for the last 38 to 40 years, and he lives in the Kilsyth area. And he's still here to talk to us, so he obviously knows something about chainsaws.
Am I turned on? Okay, all right. So yes, one thing I'll tell you is I'm not a professional cutter. So if anybody thinks they're going to get all kinds of really good stuff from me, that won't happen. I'm more like a professional safety person. And because I've been doing the chainsaw training courses, I am a provincially certified chainsaw instructor, which means that professional cutters, that before they can go to the bush and do any cutting, have to take a certain amount of training, which is basically 2 days in class and a one-on-one field exercise after that. And I'm the person that does that. So I can go to the field and then I can sign the provincial papers for them to legally go to the bush and do what they have to do. So basically that's what I do. I work with a lot of other organizations, and mainly it's all chainsaw stuff. I love to cut. I've been cutting for, well, let's say 50 years or 51 years, but the chainsaw safety part of it has been at least 40 years. I started it when I was in 1978 with the ministry, when I started training with them on forest fires and that. Anyways, like I said, I'm not a professional chainsaw instructor by any means. If you have any questions of that, I will be around for a little bit later, and I'm not afraid to answer questions. Normally my presentation, like I said, takes a long period of time. What I'm going to say is that when I was asked to do this, I was asked to say, okay, if you're dealing with hazard trees, safety around dealing with hazard trees, in my opinion, all trees are hazards. Because you can have a tree that looks like it's a perfectly good tree, and you cut it down the wrong way, and it falls against a tree that has a hazard, and then it's a hazard to you. Okay? And then you have specific trees like ash and elm that are dying and have died, and the ash in particular because the emerald ash borer is around, and it's killing off the ash trees, and ash trees have a tendency to rot at the ground, and high winds and disturbances and that will cause them to disintegrate, and they may fall over as one complete unit. So those are hazard trees. But all trees, when you're using a chainsaw, is considered to be a hazard tree. All right? So anyways, if you're thinking about doing some particular trees, and one of the things that I tell people is at the end, I'm going to be showing a small portion of part of my video part, okay? You will get a small, it's only going to be 2-3 minutes long. I will tell them when to stop the video portion of it, but I want you to see part of what the professional guys have to deal with. And just to give you a little bit of input into accidents and things like that, I was away a few years ago. I always go out west and that all the time. But anyways, so you fly back and forth. I was out there and I got a call that so-and-so had died in the bush. So when I come back, I get a call from a bunch of loggers saying we need to update our guys, we need to get them all recertified, we have to do whatever we need because the Ministry of Labor is starting to get a little wee bit upset with some of these guys. Because in a 3-year period, 3 professional loggers in Grey and Bruce County died in the bush. They're all caused by the same thing. 4 professional loggers in the same time frame were seriously injured working in the bush, all caused by the same thing. So when I came back, all I did was looked at those statistics. Because I'm a professional chainsaw instructor, I get the provincial statistics that deal with the professional cutters, and it says how this person died, what the ramifications are there any court cases, things like that impending. So I get those. So then I can look at it and say, okay, out of all these 7 people, and 3 of them were fatalities, they were all caused by the same thing. And because they weren't really classed as hazard trees, they turned out that they were hazard trees. 3 of them in particular turned out to be ash trees. And they were totally come out of nowhere, and 3 guys were killed. Okay? They weren't all at the same time. They were all individual times. So what I try and get across to people is if you're looking at a tree and you say, this is a hazard tree, or I would like to cut this tree down for whatever reason, until that tree is on the ground, there's where your problems are. There's where your hazards are. All of these individuals were killed or seriously injured from something up here. They were not paying attention. Because I trained a lot of those guys. Over the years, they become complacent. They're like anybody else. You know, you're driving down the road, you drive, you know, and you think, okay, there's no problem here. Today I pulled out my driveway, my truck went sideways pulling out my driveway. It was that icy to come here. Because in the last couple of hours, we've had snow, we had freezing rain, and then we had rain. So we had everything, and it looked fine. I pulled out my driveway right in the middle of Kilsyth, and my truck went sideways across the road. So you're anticipating, but you're not paying attention to everything else that's going on. Okay? So when you're cutting down trees, you have to really be aware of what's up here. So what I did as soon as I came home off one of my trips, I put together a training program, and my training program was 4 hours long, and it dealt strictly with this. I didn't care once the trees are on the ground. I didn't care that they were cutting off branches. It didn't bother me what kind of equipment they were using. This is what we dealt with for 4 hours. We concentrated on that. And 28 guys concentrating on this because they needed to remember what it's all about. Okay? So to give you a quick little rundown, I only have a short period of time, so I'm going to give you a quick little rundown, that if you suspect that you, or if you determine you want to cut this tree down, first thing you need to do is look up. See whether or not there's anything in that tree that can be a hazard to me. And by that I mean it could be dead branches, could be a dead top, could be a rotten spot in it, could be, you know, you see these big cankers sometimes, all kinds of things. You're looking at stuff. You're looking to see if it's straight, and if it's straight, can I put the tree in specific directions by doing it in a particular fashion? Yes or no? So you always got these things in your head. You're looking up and seeing what's going on. Okay? Once you've determined that this is a particular tree that I'm going to be cutting down, that's a direction that's got a little bit of lean. There's nothing that's going to be a problem for me because it's really hard to get people to look up. And when I mean look up, you're looking from the ground, constantly looking up the whole thing, going around to the other side and looking up because you're looking for woodpecker holes, you're looking for holes that other animals have made, or looking for any dens, anything that could cause that tree to be a problem. And then you're determining, okay, now I'm looking for my lean, I'm determining this, I'm going to put it in this particular direction. There's what I'm dealing with. Okay, so you've got all these factors that you're dealing with. The last thing you want to make sure that that tree, when you cut it down, it's going to hit the ground. It's not going to get hung up in another tree, because if it falls into another tree and it has a dead branch, or there may be a dead branch or something on the tree that you're cutting down, if that thing, it'll sway out, and then all of a sudden it'll try and stand back up again, and as soon as it tries to stand up, it'll throw whatever's dead in the tops. And what it'll do is throw it directly in the opposite direction. And usually the opposite direction is right back where you're standing. And that's what happened to these individuals. Something came from either the tree they were cutting down or came from the tree that this one hit, comes straight right back, and they never even had much time to even think about it. So you have to really keep that in mind. So you're looking for spots that, okay, if I cut this tree, here's a nice big opening. Like I get people they'll have tunnel vision, they'll look like this, and they'll say, there's a nice spot there, but you need to look up here. Remember I said everything's going to get you is coming from up here. So you want to have a nice big opening and say, okay, I know that if I cut that tree and I use my wedges and I do my chainsawing properly, that tree's going to go down that hole. That's what I want. So I'm going to get out of here now. When I cut that tree and it starts to fall down, I have my, what's called, how many people, there's a lot of people taking chainsaw courses in that. because there's a lot of it involved. You have to know, put in your 2 escape routes. Make sure that you've got them clear. Make sure I can get away. So if that tree starts to fall that direction, my escape route is over here and over here. It's not out to the side, because trees will fall sideways, and trees will land, spring back, and I've seen the stumps go right back, or the butt of the tree go right back over the stump. Could go 6, 8, 10 feet. So you never go backwards. You go out on an angle, 45-degree angle, get away from the tree. These are all safety things that I've thrown out to you. Okay, so you've got to make sure, so you've determined the tree, you've found the spot where you want to put it, where you feel comfortable with it, and that's where I'm going to put the tree, so I'm going to put the notch in that direction. I'm going to do my back cut, I'm going to use my wedges, I'm going to make the tree go that way. I'm going to make sure it goes over in that direction. You don't want to have anything by chance. You want to make sure that you've weighed it in your favor, so that nothing's going to come back to haunt you. Or you're not going to hurt somebody else, you're not going to hurt yourself, nothing else is going to happen, okay? So that's the name of the game. You want to make sure everything is good for you and your fellow workers, anybody around you. When I deal with the loggers and that, in the ministry, or the green book, the Ministry of Labor book, it says if there's a hazard, it could be a hazard to you or your fellow workers, it must be addressed before you proceed. Okay, so that's what you're looking at, you or your fellow workers. I don't want to get hurt. I do not want my fellow workers to get hurt. All right? So, once that happens and you've determined that this is where I want it to go, I've looked at the whole thing. Before I start my cutting, the last thing that a lot of people don't think about is that there's certain equipment that you should be wearing. And I've been involved, because I'm also a volunteer firefighter, I've been called by the Ontario Provincial Police, and because I'm a certified chainsaw instructor, 3 times to investigate farm accidents over the last 25 years, because somebody was killed, because we don't get statistics on that. And they were all caused by the same kind of thing. Usually the first line on my report says that other than a chainsaw with a proper working brake, there was absolutely no safety equipment worn on this site. Could the person have survived if they'd had the safety equipment on? I don't know. I refuse to answer that question. He may or may not have, but they did not survive to begin with, okay? So those are the things that you need to, so then at the end, before you start doing the cutting, you've got to make sure that you have all your safety equipment on. What I was going to do is I'm going to wear all safety equipment in, but it gets awful hot, to show everybody what the professional guys need when they go out there to do their job. And when it comes to the field work, those professional guys have to have that on, or they will not get certified. And they have to bring their own equipment. I will not supply anything. No instructor supplies anything. They bring it with them, but they need it to get their certification. So those are the kind of things that happen. When you're looking for anything else that's going on up there, right now, it's really windy out. In case anybody didn't notice, I got out of the truck and I could hardly push the door open, the wind coming down the road. It's really, really windy, unless it's died down the last 20 minutes. But those are all factors that you're looking at, too, as far as safety part of it goes. If you have a particular tree that's a hazard, and you know you want to put it on the ground, and I know I'd like to put it over there, sometimes you can wait for the wind. Say, jeepers, this is really windy today, but that's the tree I want to get, and there's the direction I want to put it. Man, that tree, the wind's going to help me blow that tree over in that direction. So you take advantage of things like that. I'm just throwing a few pointers in that out to you because of the time factor in that, but I just want you to be aware that you need to look after yourself first, look after your fellow workers, and if it reaches a point where you have a particular tree anywhere around your buildings or in your woodlot or anything that you would really like to get down because you've known it to be a hazard or that, and you don't feel comfortable with it, there are professional guys out there that can come and do that. Like I say, I'm not a professional guy. I've cut down a lot of trees in my day, but I don't classify myself as a professional at it. I do a lot of arborists groups the last while. I do the Bruce Trail people. I do a lot of different groups across the province, but I just want to give you guys the first thing you think about when you're going to cut the tree down is, that's my hazard. If there's something up there that's going to get me or somebody else, and make sure everybody's out of the way. You don't want to have somebody else standing close to you. There's been too many incidents where children have been killed, other workers and that have been killed because you haven't done your job as far as keeping them away. Okay? What have we got? Sure, Google. I just want to show you this. This is part of what the professionals have to see before we're...
A piece of Chico debris weighing 20 pounds, falling 30 feet, strikes the ground with roughly 200 pounds of force. That's enough force to snap a worker's neck in a split second. In this program, we will hear from your fellow workers and how an encounter with this deadly menace has changed their lives. Dennis DeVoe talks about his good friend and fellow worker, Dave Harvey.
Didn't answer me, and I hollered again, "Are you all right?" And I heard him say this stupid hard hat. I guess the screen had come off or something. But the way he said it to me, he didn't answer what I asked him. I said, "Did you have an accident?" And he wouldn't answer me. So I began to run up the trail, and I found him in a kneeling position between the stump and the butt of the tree. And he was trying to put the little springs that go on the back that control your screen on your hard hat back together. And at this point in time, I had realized that you could see he had an accident because his face was all pushed in, and he was in bad shape.
A Chico is a dead or partially dead tree of any size or species. Some hardwood species, especially birch, rot from the top first, making them very unpredictable. Most softwood species rot at the trunk or butt end first.
Yeah, we're not going to cover a whole bunch of it because we don't have time to deal with the whole episode and that. But there's probably at least 10 different individuals in this video, and they're all present in the video, that were hurt, badly hurt, by cutting down trees. And these are professional cutters. Like I said, we get all kinds of statistics and everything on the professional guys, but they always tell us that whatever you're hearing on the professionals, you can almost take that and multiply it by 10 for people that are not professional cutters. I think my time is almost up. Yeah, I'm going to have to end because my time is pretty well up.
Anybody? Anybody have a question for Ken? Very good. Thank you, Ken. Okay, just before we get to this last one, there's probably going to be some evaluation forms. So if everybody would fill them in, that greatly helps the folks at the Grey Egg Society and the directors to figure out what you'd like to see for next year, and things that you liked, things that you didn't like. It all goes to help improve things for the upcoming year. So take a bit of time and fill it out. It goes a long way to help. The other thing I was asked by some of the ladies and the staff here is if everybody could pick up their garbage or whatever that they've got around them when they go to leave. That helps everybody to get this place shipshape for tomorrow for crop day. So just pick your stuff up and take it out. There's lots of garbage cans and recycling. So thanks for the house cleaning. That'd be great. So our last thing for the day, it will be, we've got a panel coming up. This panel is to talk about nutrition's impact on beef cattle health, and I'm going to this, so I'll just bring her up and let her take over from here. Yeah, I guess I can run over who the panelists are. Dr. Van Mitchell, Jared Johnson, Scott Kuhl, Kevin Freiberger, and Christoph Wan. These will be your 5 panelists for this afternoon.
I'm set. Okay. Okay. I think we're set, eh, Lori? Yep. All right, so I'm going to attempt to chair these gentlemen and facilitate the discussion that we're going to have, but I'm going to start off with a few comments about the topic and how we got to this topic. So the panel's going to discuss nutrition's impact on beef cattle health, and I think to start off, we'll just kind of wrap our minds a bit around what nutrition might mean to different people. So I think when we go through some of the presentations, you'll find that nutrition means different things to different people. It may refer to feed quality, so the quality of the feed that you harvest, the composition, the energy, the protein, the mineral content is one aspect of nutrition. It may refer to ration balancing, so we have a certain set of feeds, how are we going to combine them? And then last but not least, often forgotten, is we have a perfect set of feeds, we have a perfect ration, but how are we going to deliver that to the cattle so that they get what they need? So we're going to watch for these 3 aspects to come up in discussion. And if the nutritionists were here, they'd say there's always 3 rations, 1 on paper, always perfect, the one that's delivered, so it gets put in front of the cattle, or is recommended to be put in front of the cattle, I guess. And then there's the one the cow actually eats. So 3 different things can happen here. So I'm a veterinarian, and I have a veterinary angle on how we got to this topic. As veterinarians, we tend to focus on visible health problems that we might be called to look at in cattle herds. Might have some focus on performance. I think there's probably veterinarians work with the feedlot industry in particular that focus on performance, such as weight gain and rate of gain and all that. We are going to cover some health and performance, but our real interest is going to be on the impact of nutrition on health. And so my particular interest that made me kind of suggest this topic to Lori when she asked me for some ideas is problems that I've seen over the last few years that's associated with the delivery of minerals, in particular, to pregnant beef cattle. So I think the minerals are fine on paper, but where we seem to sometimes have issues with getting the minerals into the pregnant beef cattle. And so some of this interest stems from a project that was done here in Ontario. Some of you may have been involved in it through your veterinarian. Veterinarians and their producer clients were subsidized by some funding to submit either calves, dead calves, or samples from calves who had postmortems done after they died on the farm. So these samples, or the calves themselves, could go into the diagnostic laboratory in either Guelph or Kemptville. And the objective of the whole project was to try and get a better handle on what was affecting calf health out in the field. So, you know, some tests, you've probably had samples collected from manure and that sort of thing and get sent in, but those are very particular diagnoses for particular problems. If we actually look at the postmortem of the animal, can we learn things that we didn't expect? You're maybe kind of getting the idea that I have a theme in my life is that all dead animals should be postmortemed, and I do what I can to endorse that. So the other thing we did was a survey of common management practices, and when the results from the postmortems or the samples that were sent in came back to the vets, they could lead to some discussion on the farm. So this, just a quick summary of the results here, is there were 108 calves sent in, there were 46 veterinarians, so pretty broad-based, and the one that's of interest here is out of those we had 25 calves that came from cow-calf operations. So I'm just really going to talk about those. These are the diagnoses that came from those 25 calves from the cow-calf operations. So there were 3 calves that the diagnosis could not be arrived at. We could see lesions and problems, but couldn't quite arrive at what the problem was. Not surprisingly, a bunch of them, 4 had diarrhea or enteritis. Not surprisingly, some of them had pneumonia. Septicemia is disseminated bacterial infection, so it could start with a naval ill, or it could be some other kind of bacterial infection gets into the bloodstream of the calf and circulates, and the pathologist would grow bacteria from numerous organs like the liver, lung, and the spleen, and that's probably a little higher than people would have expected, 6. Not surprisingly, but a surprise to many of the producers who submitted these calves was a diagnosis of white muscle disease in 3 of them. Most of these calves were sent in for diarrhea diagnoses, and yet the pathologist could clearly see that what really compromised the calf was white muscle disease. We had 1 calf that had goiter, which is usually associated with an iodine deficiency, and we had 2 calves that came in from the same herd that had goiter and chondrodystrophy, which is a big word, and I'll show you what it means in a minute here. But if you went through these things and said, well, how many of these relate to nutrition of the cow, you could argue that 6 out of 26, or a quarter of these, really related to things that were happening with the nutrition of the cow. And in conversations with veterinarians who then took this back to producers, it seemed like there was a bit of a knowledge gap about how the impact of what we fed to the cows could be reflected in the health of the calves. So there's white muscle disease. We saw some very common things. You've probably seen this would be a older calf with sort of stiff muscles, so it's vitamin E selenium deficiency that causes muscular dysfunction. Some are like this. That's the heart of a calf, and it's definitely hard to pick up on this picture, but there is white streakiness in here, indicating that not only is the muscle in the legs or the skeletal muscle affected, but the hearts will be as well, particularly younger calves. So we had calves like this. And then I mentioned that we saw a weirdo. Always like to have weirdos. Calf with nutritional chondrodystrophy, and these calves look like this. The 2 that we got were dead, of course, but this is one in a live calf, and you can see that there's a shortening and deformity of the limbs. There's usually a change in the head. Calf noticeably shorter, and it's affected the growth plates of the legs as well. This is thought to be a deficiency of manganese during pregnancy. So manganese is pretty hard to get deficient without really avoiding some mineral nutrition of the cow. Sadly, we see these calves in Ontario. We've had outbreaks of herds having them in northern Ontario. It looks like we have a little outbreak of these calves going on in central Ontario, where several herds, thank you, are reporting that they are seeing these. And typically in a herd that's affected with this, it won't be just 1 calf, because of course the entire pregnant cow crop is probably affected, and we usually see them to some degree, some worse than this, some born dead, some mildly deformed, but it might be up to 10 to 20% of calves in a given year. So we actually had calves like that on the project. Other cases away from the project, just talking to producers and having producers talk to their vets and having their vets call in to discuss things. We see copper deficiency, which is chronic in cows. You end up with poor doing cows, scours, failure to conceive. They don't milk well. Their calves, they don't get pregnant sometimes, and their calves don't do very well. We have secondary copper deficiency occurring in places in Ontario, which is predominantly a molybdenum excess in the forage, which ties up the copper. And we have a problem in some areas of Ontario that I think people forget that they might live in those areas, but the Winchester Bog is up near Ottawa. Certainly it looks like we have an emerging problem in the Rainy River area. We think we have something happening in central Ontario, but we don't have many diagnostics. And then the question is, how far-reaching is some of this, and are people aware of this impact of molybdenum on copper levels? Outbreaks of diarrhea in herds, talk to producers, and we saw some of these in the project. I mentioned this already. We see low E selenium levels in calves and cows. The producer sees diarrhea in calves, outbreaks of diarrhea, but really it appears that there's an underlying mineral malnutrition going on in some of these as well. So that's a question that leaves me wondering, is mineral and energy and protein possibly supplementation of pregnant beef cows not a high priority for producers, or is it really just that there's a gap in knowledge about how important the nutrition of beef cows can be? So doing a little research on this, trying to figure out if it's just us, and I'm pretty sure you can read that in the back. So this is an article from the April Beef Producer magazine, so in the U.S., and lo and behold, it says, what's the value of fixing mineral deficiencies? And it's written by a diagnostic pathologist in the U.S. and goes on to talk about various things. But the take-home points from the article are, he estimates that the return on investment with better mineral supplementation could be as high as 5 to 1 in some herds. We're going to see an increase in fertility, a decrease in disease and treatment, a decrease in mortality of maybe cows, but certainly of calves, better performance, weight gain, and possibly lower drug costs. So to be clear here, though, this is mineral supplementation to meet the animal's need. This is not mineral supplementation in excess of what they need. And the timing is critical for pregnant cows. if we want to impact on calf health, for sure, the third trimester of pregnancy is the highest priority, and probably here in Ontario also the toughest to do. Does that make sense? Right? They're in there for, if you're calving now, your third trimester's gone by, but if you're calving in May, April or May, the third trimester is now, right? January, February, March, and I think some people have complications with delivering mineral adequately to all cows, right? Remember, there's the ration that you prescribe, and there's the ration that you put out in front of the cows. Sure that each cow eats what she needs to meet her needs. So, sorry, kind of screwed that up. Calf problems do relate to cow nutrition. That was how my interest got started. And then Lori said, I have a number of different people that could address that topic. And so we have some other panel members here that are going to bring their perspectives to this issue of nutrition's impact on beef cow health. First up will be Christoph.
You're going to give me your glasses. I don't know.
Well, I didn't know if you wanted the first or second.
Sure.
Okay. You're on a different machine. Maybe in a different presentation altogether. Okay. So my goal, if everyone can hear me, Gary, can you hear me back there? Perfect, good. So my goal here today is to speak on some of the data that Dr. Peter Kotzeff and I collected a few years ago. It occurred to me when we started talking about this that I don't think I've actually shown this audience this data, even though it is quite pertinent geographically, which you'll see here in a moment. Talked about it in a few other places, but not here. The other thing I want to say is that to fix any kind of mineral imbalance problem immediately before calving, I think is a bad recipe. I would argue in my entire philosophy, which I wasn't going to get to till the Q&A, but I guess I get to do it now, is that the real intervention you want, if you want to get vitamins, minerals into that calf, is that they're in that cow. If they're in that cow's body tissues, she can incorporate those into colostrum and milk. So to think that you're going to fix those things very quickly is a problem. And that's why I wanted to show you some of this data that looks at the pasture period in the summer and what some of your forages in this part of the world are doing. And how are we doing, Lori? Okay. So again, this is data from a project that Peter and I did, and this was work that was funded at that time by the Ontario Cattlemen's Association, now Beef Farmers of Ontario, and it was funded under the Farm Innovation Program at that time. So again, the message earlier today, we were talking about funded research, and this is another example that I'll show you here momentarily. Okay. You can show me my next slide here, please. Okay, so some of the information that you have is that calcium and phosphorus, there's a lot of effort in terms of balancing those in rations, and you see that as macrominerals. That's done very quickly, and certainly in feedlots. My interest in this project, and Peter's interest in this project at that time, is that in other jurisdictions, they're much farther along in terms of using trace mineralized salt as programs. So it's fairly standard in New Zealand, and some of the work I had done in the past with some of the folks at Michigan State University, that was the approach they were taking. And remember that the entire Great Lakes Basin is selenium deficient. So if nothing else, you need to be 100% assured that you have a selenium problem and you need to fix it. And we can have a long discussion amongst ourselves about what's the best way to do it, but you have a selenium problem, you need to fix it. And in pasture, vitamin E, AD&E is probably not as big an issue. In fact, it's not as big an issue, and that's why you'll see the strategy we used in this project pertains specifically to pasture. So we undertook a whole bunch of things. We looked at blood work. Peter had some data on shooting cattle and using injectable selenium, and we analyzed all that. We did the blood work. We did the gain of grass cattle and followed them into the feedlot. We did all that stuff, but we're not going to talk about it here today. But what I am going to talk about is the sampling of the pastures we did. So these are some of the pastures here in the Grey Bruce area that we sampled over this period of time. And if you can see that yellow oval, that represents the geographic area which we're just on the very fringe of here today. And I want you to keep this in mind as we look at some of the data we're coming through. So this is the way the pasture samples were taken. They were aggregated. Summer students did this work. And then they were sent to the lab for analysis. So in terms of macrominerals, calcium, all you need to see on this graph, we're not going to get buried in this data, is the red line is the requirement for cattle. Okay? And what I want you to see is that these are all by property on this side, on the left-hand side of the slide. That is the data by property, and what that tells you is that sampling at those farms over the 2 years and over different grazing cycles, you have enough calcium in those rations. If you want to look on the right-hand side of the slide, what you see there is we did species composition at one of the properties. We actually sorted everything into its different pasture species, and you'll see variability by the pasture species. So what I want you to take from this is that within a property, whatever you've got there, overall the forages are going to maintain some kind of consistency over time. But as you get into some of these species compositions, you see interesting challenges. So here, for example, on phosphorus, so again, the red line representing the requirement for these grass cattle, and the same will be true for beef cows, because there was some cow properties in this project. You can see that these properties here are consistently low in phosphorus. So those are ones, those properties. If you were a person who owned a property like that, you should know you need to do a job of phosphorus supplementation. And if you're one of these properties, then not. And that's the kind of information I argue we all need on our properties and our forages as you go forward. So here's potassium, or K. Again, looking and comparing what was actually on offer in all those forages compared to the requirement, and they're well above it in all those cases. Okay, again, some pictures of the different properties. So calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium are largely sufficient in all of these properties that we sampled at that point in time. Several of the microminerals are also well above the recommended levels, like iron. This is a part of the world we should not really be bent out of shape about supplementing iron. In fact, some people will argue we have iron problems. And again, molybdenum is interesting. Anne's already presented that suggestion that molybdenum levels are sufficient. Okay? Copper is widely deficient. So I make a similar comment here, that with the data we saw, high levels of molybdenum on some properties and deficient copper would exacerbate copper deficiency. Okay? And again, zinc is also widely deficient in those properties we looked at. So what I want, the message I want for all of you is that these patterns of sufficiency or insufficiency, which are good nutrition words, I like nutrition words still, by the way, those are conserved. Okay, so if you build a library of a history on your property, you'll know what your forages do. When you change species, if you go from pasture to corn, they're going to change. But if you're staying with a continuous pasture program, then you should know what those are. Salt is universally deficient. Selenium is universally deficient. Copper probably is. So you're starting to get a message there's things you need to do and that you need to take care of, and you can't just leave them, I would argue, even to that last trimester. So again, just thinking about that in that area represented by those 14 different properties, we saw some patterns that hopefully are pertinent to you. I'm not going to talk too much about this, and this becomes a philosophical thing. Do you want to deliver this as trace mineralized salt? And I think it's more than just a typical bagged product. It needs to be some kind of customer formulation of some kind of specialty product to make sure you hit those parameters we talked about. So you can do that as trace mineralized salt or premix on pasture. Okay. Again, I'm not suggesting this is a program for winter feeding or TMR systems. And I think all of you should be doing forage sampling, not just your winter feeds, but also your summer feeds, so you know what your cows, or grass cattle, young cattle, if that's your business, are doing in terms of their mineral status in their bodies as they come into this winter feeding period. So yeah, that's what pasture sampling looks like, and I'll turn it back. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to say it's an honor to be asked to speak here today. I didn't know what I was getting into when I said I'd do this. But I'm Kevin Freiberger. We run 650 cows by Walkerton. We have 350 black and red Angus cows. They're bred Charolais. 250 Angus, straight Angus cows. They're bred, 110 of them are bred Angus and 140 are bred Hereford. We got 60 purebreds, 30 are Angus, 20 are Herefords, 10 are Charolais. We call hard for feet and udders. 15% a year we turn over. It's actually hard keeping enough good cows that's around for the amount that we do ship. We produce all our own females. That's why we breed the straight Anguses and the Herefords, the Baldies. So we make all our own heifers. We rely on heavily on EPDs. We also make our own bulls when we do buy bulls, which we don't buy very many a year anymore because of us having our own genetics. We try to put a little more money in our bulls. We try to buy a little better bulls. That allows us to do that. That's a little bit more rundown here. We start creep feeding in August, wean late in October. That's what we wean our calves at approximately. We shove them right through. We don't coast them. When they're on creep feed, we try to get everything in we can, and we ship a little on the lighter side compared to what the industry's gone to. We have tried to hold them back a bit in a couple previous years, but we found there was no money in it for us. The fall, most of the calves that are shipped in the fall as steers, the price is dropping. We'd rather get rid of them lighter and a little earlier. So ours go out generally at 1,400 to 1,500 pounds a piece on the loads. Our cows, we winter them outside. Most of them never see a barn, or maybe just for if they get chased in a barn or something like that for sorting, but they're not in buildings much. They're outside all the time. They got a good hair coat. They're on sandy soils where they winter, and bush at both ends of the field. They're fed in a cornfield so that we can work that field up and make good use of the nutrients, whereas if they were on a pasture field, there'd be too much kill out. We don't have any feeders, bottoms with feeders. It's just easy to pull the feeder ahead to a clean place every day, and that way any debris, stones, wire, any foreign objects, the cows aren't exposed to them continuously. You pull the feeder ahead and they got fresh ground. This is typically what we calve in. They calve on about 45 acres of hills and sand, and any that due to bad weather or problems that the calf can't get up and suck, those are mothering pens on each side of that alley, and we have 2 of those styled barns, and that's all we got. There ain't nothing else. That's a cabin that we lived in for about 6 weeks. We lived in it, but we had a little accident there and that thing burnt down. So we're operating out of a trailer right now until we get another cabin built. But that's calving grounds when we're doing it, and you can see how we try to let Mother Nature take its course. We try not to touch them unless we have to. They're about, 4 or 5 years ago, we got all that snow, that heavy winter where we had, by Paisley, I believe, there was some 12-foot snowbanks. That was that year, and when we started calving on those hills, this was about 2 weeks after we were already calving. We had a payloader over there making pathways for the cows to get around and for ourselves with the bikes to get around. But this, during some drought years, if we're really short of hay, we snap a lot of corn for the pits, and then we've put a disc spine in and follow right in behind with another harvester to pick up the stover. And you can get maybe 3 ton to the acre of stover you can pick up, and just that stretches the hay out over the winter, just helps you get through. And it doesn't make bad silage. It does ferment, and it's mainly leaves, which are very digestible. And in the fall of 2000, we had about 10 of the biggest calves die. And it was all just like pneumonia. You'd swear they had pneumonia. And we had one calf, we put a rope on, and this was after we already started having problems with this. We put a rope on, and he was puffing, and within a minute or two, he just dropped over dead right in front of us. So we were working with our vet, but the calves had no temp, and they just died so fast, and they were like 500-pound calves. And he was stumped. So he was sent some organs away to Olds, and within a short time come back that it was white muscle disease. And we've always needled our calves at birth with 2 cc's, and we never had any problems with white muscle disease previous to this. So Olds sent us back some interesting literature on it, and that helped us out, and saying that if you are expecting to get more tons out of your pasture, you have less selenium. There's only so much given up each year through the ground into the plants, and that if you're going to double you're going to whale the fertilizer to it or manure or whatever you got, you're going to have less selenium taken up and put into the calves. So since then, we definitely put a lot of selenium, all we can, in our minerals and creep feed, and we give them extra shots in the fall whenever we're running them through in September and once they get into the feedlot. That's is how we do it in September. We move that from pasture to pasture, and that's when we also pull the bulls, and we run those calves down an alley into that chute we made ourselves, and we can process them pretty quick. We'll run 6 calves into that, and we're sleeping if we can't process them in less than a minute a calf. Yeah, we ship about 3% a year to vaginal prolapses, and it always shows up when your cow's heavy in calf and you start to see that beach ball effect coming out the back end. Read some articles saying that that it could be caused by too much potassium, and also by the type of animal, the breed, and we didn't see it in the breeds, because in the past we've had some different breeds, a bit of Limousine, a bit of that. We still had the same problem. Bloodlines, we did find that some bloodlines are worse than others for this. So we did a little work. We looked into our minerals, and there wasn't that much potassium in our mineral. So then potassium, we found out that potassium is in potash that we spread on our alfalfa. And we grow a lot of alfalfa. We actually grow straight alfalfa. So we don't leave it down very long, about 2 to 3 years. And we spread about 400 pounds a year. We get a good 3 cuts off, heavy 3 cuts off our hay. So we figured, okay, it could be sucked up through that. But then we had it tested, our hay tested, and it came back there was no heavier potassium levels than in good dairy hay. But the only thing we figured out that our cows eat that all the time. They don't get any grain, they get nothing else, whereas dairy rations, their feed stuffs are mixed with different things. And we also, our nutritionist told us that he found out that there's a lot of estrogen in hay that could also promote this, or in alfalfa. They also could promote this from happening. So now we're seeding more grasses. We're swinging back to more grasses and leaving it down longer. Well, that's what we're going to try with that. This past year, I know a lot of producers had some issues. I was asked by a few different people about how our hay was from last year with so much rain, not this droughty year that we had this year, but the year before. And our cows, we had pretty good. As far as our statistics this year, from what we preg checked in 2017, we weaned 97.5 of them this fall. From the cows that went to full term, carried the calf full term into the spring, we raised 99.2% of them. Now, our 10-year average is about 1 point off of that. So that's what we normally average in our 10-year, but that's what we did last year, is one of our best years ever. But we did have one problem with that wet year. If we have too much hay, we do everything in green hay. 100% is green wrapped hay. And if we're going to have too much, it doesn't keep well into a second year. So we try and do that dry. Well, with it raining a lot of the time in 17, we were having a hard time getting it dry. And we had one field there that we had cut maybe 4 or 5 days down. And they're calling for rain, so we made the decision to take it for green hay, even though it was almost dry. We had some moldy spots in that row, and it ended up where our purebreds are. If I seen much mold in that row, it was just a hit and miss. And if I seen much, then I'd just dilute it, and I wouldn't give them the cows at that farm very much. These purebreds are with our heifers, which they don't run out in the field. They were running in just a yard situation. They weren't with the main herd of cows. So I would dilute the hay. Well, I had hired a fellow, he fed them one day for me, and all from that row, and he ended up into some spoilt bales. I'd say about 30% of the hay. I seen it after he fed them. I didn't think it was going to be that big an issue. I had forgot, though, that we had bought some purebreds, heifers, that were going to calve in January, where we normally calve in April. And so I didn't think it was that big a concern. Well, the next day we had 2 of them that thrown their calves. So that's just how critical it is in the last month that the cows, you try not to get any spoilt feed that they can get into. That's typically how we move our hay. We've got a few of those rigs, and it's really speeded up us moving it. So I guess that's about it. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see everyone out today. It's a nice day to be down here and doing this. My name's Scott Cool, and we farm just at Katy. We have the Katy Livestock Market, and we also keep some cattle as well. I guess I got into the cows about 20 or 25 years ago. Working at the sale barn, before I got into the cows, I always heard guys coming in and they're telling me about their calving problems and C-sections in the middle of the night and checking their cows at 4 in the morning and dealing with scours and stuff like that. And I thought, geez, that sounds like a good party. I'm going to buy some cows. So I bought. I thought too at the time that really I didn't have any knowledge on cows and calves. We always backgrounded cattle and grass cattle. So I thought, well, if we're in this business, I should know a little bit more about cows and calves so I can relate better to our customers. So I bought 10 or 12 cows that fall, and I just calved them out around a an old bank barn, and there's lots of stuff that I didn't know. I didn't know anything. I never seen a calf born before that, and so there's lots of challenges I had in those the first year especially. But I had lots of guys that I could call on, and I got through it, and I really enjoyed that first year of calving them and stuff, and every year after that I kind of added to my cows, and I'm up to about 100 cows. Last winter I had 120. I'm down to about 100 right now, and I've always bought in my heifers. I've added a few cows to my herd, but I've basically all started with heifers, and they're all Red Angus and Simmental cross cows. And I always use, I have been using Charolais bulls on them. The replacement heifers that I buy in are usually bred Black Angus. I start calving around the end of January, the first part of February, and my calves all go to the Georgian Bay Club at the pre-sort sales in the fall. My Charolais calves and any red calves that I have would sell in the Charolais Calf Club sale, and any black calves I sell in the Blue Water Angus sale. Like I said, we live right in Katy, and my farm's just east of Katy, and I winter them all on, there's about a 200-acre farm where they're at right now, and right now, because they're getting close to calving, I've got them up into about a 15 to 20 acre calving field. And I always preg check around the first part of January. We just got that all done. And when I preg check, I also vaccinate at that time with Bovishield 5 and Bovishield 5 LP5. And I re-tag them with the RFID tags, and I double tag my cows with management tags in case one loses a tag, then I've got a backup number. And it doesn't happen very often that they lose both tags, but it does happen the odd time. So they get Bovishield LP5, Scour Guard, and Musi, and Ivamac at that time. And I should back up, out of the 100 cows that we preg checked last week, there was 6 cows that were open, and the vet thought that probably my calving was going to be probably 3 to 5 weeks later than last year, and I would attribute that to poor feed quality last winter and dry pasture this summer. But I was happy that there was only 6 open cows. And first 2 or 3 weeks in May, they're gone. When I start feeding the cows, I usually start off with my best. All my hay's all put up as silage bales. I wrap all my hay, and when I start feeding them, I usually start them off with the best hay that I've got for them, and I start with my mineral at that time. And my hay, I either roll it out. I've got a 3-point hitch bale unroller. If the ground's frozen up good enough, I unroll it on top of the ground. And if not, this has been a bad winter. The ground's not froze, so I've had to feed in round bale feeders on a cement yard. So this is my calving facility here. Right now, the cows are all in that field right along there. And I've got a old conventional bank barn right there that I've got cameras in. I've got internet at that barn, and I've got calving cameras all set up there around that barn and around. There's a little calving yard just to the south of that barn. Actually, that cow looks like she's maybe going to have a calf right And then once they calve out, and I feel that the calf is strong enough, they're given white muscle, and the males are all elasticized when they're a day old. And once I feel that they're mothered up good enough and the calf's strong enough, then they move them out of that little yard that's right here into these little, I got 3 little maternal pens that I put them out into those yards with calving shelters. And they'll stay out in there for anywhere from 5 to 10 days, depending on how many calves I've got coming at once. And once I feel that they're strong enough, then I bring them in to that barn and I give all the calves in force. And then they go down that laneway there into that there's a bigger field there with a couple calving shelters. And from there, then they'll stay there until they're usually, the youngest calf would be a month old, so the oldest calf could be a month and a half old. When they're that old, then I move them back to a 40-acre pasture field that they're basically on their own. I just feed them hay, and I don't spend as much time checking them because they're usually well enough on their weight. Yeah, so there's a picture of the calving yards right there. There's a little calving or maternal pen. I like to introduce creep feed right when they're old enough to walk. In those little calving shelters, I've got mangers in there that I've put textured creep feed in there that is with decox in it. That as soon as they want to eat it, it's available for them there. To me, there's nothing better than seeing a calf suck for the first time or seeing a creep feeder full of calves. I really like seeing that. I think that when they get on creep feed, it helps build up their energy levels and it helps them fight off any elements or viruses that are happening to be going around. So I always use a good textured 18% creep feed. As far as mineral goes, I try to keep mineral in front of the cows all the time. Right now, I started when I pulled them off grass, I started them with a cow calving mineral. And I always make sure that there's momentum in it. I feel that builds up good cocci resistance through their colostrum, and that passes on down through the calf to fight off any cocci when they're a few weeks old. My daughter, she worked for a feed company, and this past summer, and they were selling mineral with garlic in it. So she thought I should try that for flies, and I think it actually helped. The flies seem to be not as bad with the cows that were on the garlic. And the lick tubs, last winter I went through lots of lick tubs because the feed quality was bad. I could see my cows going down, and so I wanted to give them a little bit extra. There's no way that I could feed. I didn't have any silage that I could feed them, and no way of really feeding it to them. So I got a little bit extra into them through the lick tubs, and I was satisfied with the results from that. After they do calve, when they go back to that back field, then I put lots of lick tubs out there for them. They do seem to like them. They seem to great. The bulls, I pull the bulls away from the cows usually around the middle of July, and I just move the bulls all up into those small calving yards that I got for the calving, and they're either fed pasture or haylage and a little bit of grain till the cows come off grass. And then when I'm tight for space, right now my bulls are with some background and calves that I've got for up in my yard, and so they're getting lots of grain, and they're a little bit of a nuisance at the start. The calves like to chase them around a wee bit and whatnot and ride them, but they've all adjusted now, and the bulls are feeding well, and everybody's getting along. So my calves, being that I sell my calves in the pre-sorted sales at Katy there, my calves are all vaccinated in the spring before they go to grass around the first part of May. And then in the middle of September, first part of September, I try to get them all boosted. And there's a picture of my processing crew. A couple summers ago, we had some pairs up in Manitoulin Island. So I took a couple guys up and we processed them up there. And one guy was, you may know, was George McCall. And it was kind of a warm day, and George found it kind of warm and peeled off a few clothes and was right down at the coveralls. You got some looks, I tell you, on the Chi-Chi on the way home. And then there's a picture of our calves at the calf sale that happens in the fall there, Katie. And that's about it.
All the chairs are I think we're live. So thank you for those excellent presentations. I'm pretty much in awe of the producers we have up here today. Those are fantastic operations. We're just going to ask for Barrett and for Van. Do you have any comments on Jared? Sorry, I'm the same character. Ask if you have any comments on anything you heard or anything you'd like to add or make comments on. Van, you got anything you want to say?
I'd just taken down a few, how about that? I just had taken down a few notes there as we were listening, and I thought it was interesting there, the study about copper, zinc, and selenium being deficient, and how truly important those three are in cow-calf and in feedlot. And we find the same thing as a vet clinic, particularly selenium. Selenium is huge. We've seen it with cow-calf issues. We've seen it with weak-born, stillborn calves. Then, of course, we see it all the way up through the feedlot. So I definitely would agree that we see that a lot. In the feedlots, we're always working with zinc, trying to get zinc into to try to help us with foot rot. So, no, I see that on our side as well, not just the pasture side, but the cattle side. And I totally agree. It's nice to know what you've got in the pastures and in the grass and know what to deal with and how to supplement it.
Yeah, I think Van and I, vets and feed companies work together more and more, and I think this is a great topic. Last year was definitely a challenge. I mean, I work a lot of my rations on the feedlot side. Majority of feedlots, we do rations, we do feed tests. I bet you 1% of my cow-calf people actually test stuff. So Christoph, taking those samples, I know we did that 3 or 4 years ago to reevaluate our mineral supplementation program, just for that same reason, that a lot of these supplementations are based on a national company's whatever. And I mean, if you look at it, I think I agree with Christoph. On that part, we're not going to see huge changes from year to year on what we need for trace minerals. But having said that, last year I think we saw more protein in straw than we did our hay. So honestly, I've been doing this for 20 years, and that was the worst quality of feed I saw. So, and I think talking about that, we did see quite a few issues.
Thanks. So Jared, I gotta ask, because you mentioned it, very few people test. What's a way to motivate people to test, or what can we say here today that will send these people home to test? Producers got a comment, or are you testing, and do you think it's something we should flog? Testing forage?
We don't test any of our, well, we do at times, but a lot of our kids were at the sale barn, we're in touch with a lot of producers, and they seem to do the testing, and we do the listening, and if everybody's down, if everybody's got low feed, cheap bugger, we do.
Down and dirty here. Kevin, any comments on that, testing or not testing?
No, we have not tested our full. Try that. Yep. All right. No, we have not done any testing. Our cows, being we have green feed all the time, and we're flipping our alfalfa so often, pardon me, we just keep feed in front of them all the time, and our cows are in good shape. It's easier to keep them at home when they got lots of feed in front of them. And nutrition in our farm doesn't seem to be a problem. Not that we can't run into problems like we did in 2000 with the white mussel, but since then we went to half organic selenium in our minerals for our cows. And like I said, we're needling them quite often with selenium. Every time they go through the chute, we are doing something that way. So other than that, we haven't seen an issue that we've got to do it. And everything costs. And farming it's who can do it the cheapest, because they aren't going to pay you any more. So that's the bottom line.
So Scott wasn't too far off in his comments. We're getting close here. I'm going to ask all of you the same question. I'm going to start with Van. Practice tips, something you've seen someone do feeding-wise that you thought was a useful tip that other producers could benefit from knowing about?
I guess right offhand, something I guess that I would say is, like say lick tubs, for example. They're an excellent opportunity for cattle to be licking, salivating, just in general a good thing for them. They're always going to be lower in the minerals, because in order to be a free choice, it's going to be lower. So definitely a good supplementation, but not a replacement for poor quality, low nutrient type feed. So they're there and they're good, but if it comes to a true deficiency, we're going to need a little bit more. Things too is protein. It was mentioned about the straw being darn near as good as the hay. Mineral deficiency mixed with protein deficiency spells lots of issues. Reproduction in cattle, weak-born calves, and the list goes on and on. I think feeding for scours, calf scours, is probably one of the biggest heartbreaking issues, or the biggest, that's when producers are not too happy about being producers, is when there's a bad calf scour storm going on. So I do totally agree, selenium is huge. Both the cows, one abortion storm and weak-born storm that I saw, 10 out of the first 15 calves born were either weak-born or stillborn. And doing troubleshooting with this group, it just did not look like a parasite or any other kind of a infection issue. We did some testing, and the cows, every cow we tested, both aborted ones and yet to come, had 10% of selenium levels being normal. So they were extremely low, and a shot of selenium, it was amazing what it did. So guys who are really focusing on enhancing the cows in that third trimester, I believe, are huge.
Christoph, you practiced it?
I guess my comment would be, so people would need to understand my background is in nutrition even before I did the sustainability work I do now. And as a government nutritionist, I'm a nutritionist of last resort. And I think you can relate to some of that. And I would say that the commonality and failure with most of the phone calls that get to me is that people have not reconciled simple things like feeding rates in their own cow herd with the tag requirements. Most of your tags will say, this premix is to be fed at 120 grams per day or something. It'll be something like that. And I would argue precious few of us in the industry actually ever do that math, ever read that tag, ever count how many head and how many bags should have disappeared in a period of time.
Good tip. Kevin, anything you want to add?
Yeah, with our own cows, I do read the tag. But during the summer, it's not an issue. When they're on green pasture, they love that salt and mineral. It just disappears, and actually, if you keep putting it out there, they actually eat too much. So at that time of year, we try to limit it to what they should be getting. The problem is in the winter. You just try and get that stuff into them. I know our cows right now, the one, that 500 group that's out on corn stalks, they should be getting about 1.8 bags a day. And there for a while, you couldn't get 1 bag a week in there. They picked up now that the weather has turned milder, and they're eating more now, but they're still not eating what they should. In the past, we've actually tried to mix green with it, chop with it to entice them to eat it. It's still a challenge, well, that's what it is. It is what it is, like they say.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I guess tip thing, we're going along the same direction, but I mean, my awesome part of my job is I get to see what works and what doesn't work. It's not what you learn at school, it's what you see on the stomping ground. So I've seen a lot of different ways. I mean, we talk about lick barrels, we talk about, I mean, I feed a couple pounds, my cows start calving here right now, I feed them 2 or 3 pounds of grain, cheap grain screening pellets, and then top dress, you know, I know how much, you know, mineral works. Obviously that works for me, that doesn't work for Kevin. I have other large producers that, you know, cost is an issue. So they've used, you know, say TMRs, but if you're gonna do that, you better have enough bunk space. So I think knowing how you're gonna deliver it at those critical times. Now the one flip side is I was always taught though too, is knowing your cows, whether we're sampling things or not. A mentor nutritionist, when I first started, she taught me, she said, an anorexic girl never gets pregnant. And it always stuck with me. So we can talk about minerals all we want, but if your cows don't look good, you know, their tail is sticking out, we're gonna have these issues. So those are the critical ones.
I don't have really much to add to that, other than I just go by eye, and if I think the cow looks good, and I try to keep the mineral in front of them all the time, and if the cow looks good, her hair's good and healthy, and if I'm not having any troubles calving, I think things are fine.
Okay, those are good practical tips. I think we have a question from the back.
Not so much a question, just a comment to encourage customers for seed for silage analysis. Our company offers a cash incentive for that, and maybe that might be something other feed companies may want, or seed companies may want to consider doing.
Do we have other questions on the floor? I think we got, make Lori run here.
Cow minerals went up $2 a bag.
Can you put my Fitbit on?
Somebody has to pay for it.
Somebody has to pay for it. Pretty sure they're not paying for the selenium analysis.
Kevin or Van or anybody, you seen any correlation in the round bales and the mold situation between the color of the mold and the level of toxicity in the mold in the bale?
Okay, do you want to start
Yeah, that
with
sounds like
color
good
of
for
the
you.
mold in bales and level of toxins?
Yeah, I truly wish there was a good, easy answer to that. Going over different herbs, I'd say in general there's not a particular color that I find you can go specifically to. Like we'll find Listeria in every different color of mold you can see, I guess. So that's my personal experience. I cannot correlate it to a specific gross color. No. What about you guys?
Any other comments?
Anything like that?
I think there's general agreement on that one. Yep. Okay, in the back.
Just to wonder if there's any concerns or strategies you're using with the vomitoxins that are in the corn this year, and how you guys are dealing with that.
Vomitoxins in corn. Jeremy, do you want to start that? You probably.
Okay, this is why I always like having some cows, because I think like a farmer. Careful of the snake oil salesman, because this goes on, this sort of ticks me off. There's some people that say, you got this or you got that, and you maybe don't have a big problem. You know, we talked about yonis, false negatives, false positives, and if there is a problem, make sure you're checking with that binder. I mean, this is the thing about antibiotics. Antibiotics are true, science proven they have to be, but some of this other stuff, and there's lots, don't get me wrong, there's lots of good products out there. Make sure they show you the research the company's done, that's all. Because you're gonna spend enough money on this, binders or whatever. The other thing is maybe just look at which type of animals, what you're gonna feed it to. If you can test it, you see you've got toxins, if you got zearalenone or whatever in there, feed it to your feeders or swap it with your neighbor. Just jumping off from what Jarrett is saying here, in terms of that testing, the thing you need to be, and that's the problem why no one's gonna up here and say that pink mold is delicious, but black mold is bad, is because usually the molds come together and different toxins can masquerade as other ones. So you need to be really clear on that lab analysis that you're not just testing for the one thing. So this year, there's been a lot of attention on vomitoxin. But if you really believe there's a problem, odds are there's a lot of other problems in there. Because it's not just going to magically be alone. There's going to be other fungal products in there too. So if you're going to bother doing the test, do a good one.
So Christoph, have you seen results of testing across the province at all?
I have, and others in this room will have too, but all the sentinel testing that, for example, our ministry did was done on Dawn, or vomitoxin, same thing. So all those other toxins like T2 and some of those other ones that could very easily have come along, I don't know that we do have that.
Not necessarily from us, no.
This question is for Christoph. How do you go about to get a test done on your forage or your grasses? That's question one. Question two, I noticed on your slide you had a Paisley knapweed. Is there a nutritional value in that weed?
Okay, so funny story. So the Paisley knapweed, I'll answer that first. So any of you that do know Dr. Kotzeff, you'll know that his interests are wide-ranging. He has a farm at Paisley that I've put photos of on Twitter and such that is like an infestation of knapweed, and he swears cattle still do well there. So we sent some of that stuff away. And nutritionally, you know, knapweed may be a weed, but the patches I have in my lawn, I think of Peter Kotzeff fondly, because it's not even so bad a feed source, really. As for testing, you can go to any one of the labs that you have an arrangement with already and take your clipping. You need to be really careful with pasture clipping that you're not just yanking it up and taking soil samples. That's why you saw scissors in that picture. Otherwise, you're going to get soil mineral analysis, and you send it into your lab the way you would a hay sample or a silage sample, and just denote that it's a pasture sample. And don't do the selenium test. I guarantee it'll come back deficient and it costs $50.
Good tip there. Okay, we'll take another question from the side here.
Is anyone concerned about water quality and testing water?
The question was, anyone concerned about water quality and testing water? In terms of animal health, right? In terms of animal health?
You guys are doing
I'm going to say yes.
And nutrition.
Yes.
Dan, you want to go ahead?
I guess, yeah, as far as we go with our testing, with our water, we find that ruminants are extremely wonderful at drinking poor quality water and making a lot of good moves ahead. So have I personally run into any true water quality issues short of a bad selenium well? I'd say it's been pretty sparse for having true water quality issues.
Any other comments from anyone?
Again, being a government guy, the data that would come to me, and Ann, you've seen this kind of data before too, is that there are patches in Ontario where there are bad wells that have, you know, extreme sulfur levels or this or that. And those are the ones you'd look out for. And I think water, again, you should all have a water test on file. You should know what your iron levels are, what your whatever, right, levels are. And you may find that I know there's one not that far from here, there's a rumor of a patch in the Kincardine area where there's some nasty wells that do strange things that nutritionists struggle with. So yeah, you should do that too.
Right here, okay.
Scott, what dose of MUSI are you injecting to these cows before calving?
Grace, you did that needle.
I think it was 4 mLs.
It was 4 mLs. Is that right, Van?
4 ml only?
We use a different product most of the time on them, but without, I would just go completely label dose on it. Like we use two different other products, and label dose is exactly where we want to be with it. I don't have my phone for the compendium, Ron.
So the label dose is 1 ml per 100 pounds. as far as I remember.
It is with the 2 products that we use, yes. Yep.
To be
Yep.
clear, there's 2 parts to the label though. There's the label indication, what you're doing it for. If it doesn't say it's for cows, for reproductive performance or supplementation, that might not be the dose. If that's definitely the dose for calves. You want to make sure that you've got the dose for cows. I think that's an extra label use, right?
Yeah,
I don't think that's on the label, but we can check. Standard.
Yeah, we'd have to talk about that one-on-one, I guess, but we've had good luck with a couple of other products. And
The treatment on selenium or Solani or Disticil.
Wait, we need to capture you.
Cheating because I have Dan's app on my phone, but yeah, so 1 cc per 100 on calves, and if it's treatment, it's 2 cc's per 100 on selenium, E, and Disticil,
For calves.
or cows for treatment.
I think
So
we could-
treatment is a.
Treatment's 2 per 100.
Yeah, but
Prevention's 1 per 100.
treatment is a diagnosed deficiency, right? Not just, I think I want to prevent something. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure, we didn't give him 7 or 8. I'm pretty sure it was, I was the guy bringing the cows in, but I think it was 4, I think. I heard them saying, Ralph.
Yes, but I gave 10.
Huh?
10 cc.
So the only reason we're stressing over the dose here is a little is good, but a lot can be too much, and there is selenium toxicity is available. So when you start multiplying the dose by decimal points, you can get into selenium toxicity, because there is selenium in the feed, selenium in the injection as well too. So there is some caution around sticking to the label.
in a sense, selenium, yeah, selenium has your, you know, you want to make sure that you give it under the skin, you give it label directions like that to avoid some anaphylactic shock and whatnot.
One final question or comment?
One final question coming at us.
Just one question about, do you see increase in ergot in your area at all?
I can kind of answer that one. We don't. As a road, we don't feed the feeds and we don't seem to grow the, do you see it in Alberta?
There's been a large increase, yes. Yep.
Okay. And that shows up as what? Ergot in the feed or ergot in the, it's no signs in the cow?
It does, it can show up in signs in the cow. We're doing some work now to see what the kind of the parts per million, what the limits are, but, and there's issues with thermoregulation, behavior, all kinds of things, yeah.
We take that as an early warning, something to watch for here that we don't have yet, maybe to the same degree. I think that's, we're starting to get some exits at the back there, because I'm sure people got chores and things to do, and the weather apparently is not great. So I personally want to thank all of our panel participants. You did a great job, super, super great. And of course, I want to thank Lori for the organization that went into getting this panel together, and the invitation, and thank you all for coming.
It's always like, thanks for talking one-on-one. Thank you.
Good job, guys.